Chapter 365. Oh my God, monsters are attacking the city? The moment they saw the grayish-black tide, the beasts gasped. Some people couldn't believe it. Where did this playful crimson moon come from? Young people nowadays are playing with yesterday's broken boat. You can't keep up with the times. Can you stop talking about old jokes? Let's surf the internet together another day. I just said it, okay? It's not my fault that I can't keep up with the times. So you admit that you're talking about old jokes, right? The bird and the leopard bickered, but it heated up the atmosphere. It dispelled the shock and uneasiness in everyone's hearts, and the atmosphere was slightly relaxed. The image on the screen was still moving forward. It was as if they had flown into a gray ocean, and they couldn't see the end. Even with the Phoenix's extreme speed, it couldn't go deeper into the endless gray. It was better to say that even if they couldn't see it in person, everyone could catch a glimpse of the momentum and madness from the mottled gray. It was a mixture of pale white and dark, a gray color made of blood and flesh. Every ripple, every rise and fall, and even every pixel represented the existence of the enemy. If they looked down from a high altitude where they couldn't reach, it was just an insignificant gray. But now, this boundless gray was gradually covering them. It would only take an instant to swallow up all their hard work over the past few days. Even if each individual was insignificant, what was terrifying was the terrifying scale. It was as if the malice of the whole world was united and imposed on this lonely city. Dark clouds covered the sky. Do you have a more detailed image? The one who asked was the representative of the scholars, the fox. From the beginning to the end, it had its tail curled up, and there was an iron pipe in the corner of its mouth. It smoked leisurely, and then smoke mixed with water vapor rose from its fox head. It was shockingly hot. Behind it, illusionary bubbles kept rising and then quickly bursting. Those were countless possibilities and branches. In the madness that was close to exhaustion, countless solutions and answers kept appearing and being rejected. Smack! He spat out a mouthful of blood. It habitually raised its tail to wipe its mouth, picked up its special cup of water and rinsed its mouth. It wanted to vomit, but when it remembered that it was in Huai Shi's head, it suddenly felt embarrassed and swallowed it. It coughed twice and said, "The reference conditions are not enough. I need more details." No. The Phoenix shook her head. I wanted to go deeper, but I sensed something that could threaten me. That feeling, how should I describe it? It paused for a moment and said seriously, "Just like the divine remains." In the silence, no one said anything. "Then, let me give you a briefing." Fox's voice was still calm. 2 days ago, our furthest sentry post received an abnormal quality observation. At first, I thought, well, a few more companions like Huai Shi had rushed over, but in fact, the index was completely different from Huai Shi, so I asked the immortal bird to make an emergency trip, and the result was seen by everyone. Now, our border sentry post has been silent for 4 hours and hasn't replied to any messages. It looks like they've been digested, right? Is it confirmed? Someone was still in disbelief. There's no need to think twice about the corrosive species. Fox calmly told the bad news. What you saw just now were all corrosive species. If I'm not wrong, these are all the things in this hell that can still breathe other than us. I mean, all of them, all of them. I hope everyone can understand one thing. The enemies that are preparing to attack us now are all the remaining corrosive species in this hell. After Fox finished speaking, he emphasized again, all of them. There was no need to use numbers to estimate. The space inside this witch's night was as big as a giant continent. Once the depth began to deepen, the number of corrosive species that produced aberrations would definitely be more terrifying. Moreover, corrosive species could also reproduce. Some corrosive species that were known for their numbers could give birth to 100 or 80 in a litter. A salmon could give birth to thousands of seeds at a time, and it would only be more exaggerated in the ecology of hell. Just based on the range of the video, the preliminary estimate was that there were hundreds of millions of them. Just in terms of numbers, they had the ability to completely destroy the current Titan Empire. Moreover, who said that corrosive species couldn't fuse with God's remains? A more pessimistic inference was it possible that the explorers who had undergone deification would be corroded by the abyss? Most of the time, art came from reality. It wasn't unreasonable for the corruption to be 3 times stronger. The attacking side naturally had the advantage. What's their purpose? Hydra asked. Is it really like the game mechanics, where a wave of monsters came to attack the city? Isn't that simple? They're hungry and want to eat something. Unfortunately, all the hot food in this world jumped into the same bowl. After Fox's calm expression, the corner of his eyes twitched. He couldn't hide his regret. In the end, it was still too early to be happy. No, he should have thought of this when he chose the location to set up camp. In the end, he only paid attention to the rich mining area and the surrounding resources at that time. He didn't think that there would be new enemies after all the explorers united. As a result, all the war fortifications were only at the standard level. Although it wasn't abandoned, it didn't deliberately develop it. It was just that the survival situation was already very serious. He didn't want to plant any seeds of disharmony because of the appearance of various weapons. In order to maintain stability, he deliberately maintained restraint in this aspect. Between military force and survival, he naturally leaned towards the latter. In the end, it was hard to buy with money. When the whole world gradually died, all the beasts would be prepared to fight to the death. They didn't even need much rationality and thinking. As long as they could feel hunger, they would instinctively seek the existence of food. Some of the higher species could still maintain their thinking ability after being deformed. They were more difficult to deal with. They would even suppress internal friction and choose to join forces with their former strong enemies. It was just like a miracle. If such an incident happened to humans, there would be countless poets singing about the greatness of human nature, right? But now, the beast's nature had also become great. It caught Fox off guard. He suppressed the anger and frustration in his heart and forced himself to remain calm. According to the estimation of the control room, according to their current speed, they should appear within our sight in another 5 days. Well, basically, it would be no different from reaching our doorstep by then. This speed might not be their highest speed. The diamond leopard, who had just livened up the atmosphere, reminded. If they are hunting, then they must conserve their strength to the greatest extent. Then 3 days it is, Fox said. We have to prepare for the worst. And then, someone asked. Then conserve your strength, listen to orders, and bravely kill the enemy. There's no need to say more, but now is not the time for you to fight. Fox sternly reminded. I don't think I need to remind everyone of the meaning of this city. A stable base is the premise of all our plans. It is best not to have heroes who run out to die without saying a word. Even if you can kill 10,000, 100,000, or even 1,000,000 enemies before you die, it's not worth it. Because your corpses can catalyze more corpses, and you might even become one of the enemies after you die. So, the purpose of this meeting is to tell everyone that we will have a plan, we will carry out a plan, and we will win through this plan. That way, no matter how tragic the victory, it will not hurt us. Remember, our goal is not to win, but to continue living in this dead world, and to continue living better. As he spoke in a low voice, the city behind him rumbled. As countless buildings moved, the entire steel city was instantly riddled with holes. After the camouflage was removed, countless complex and massive underground fortifications were revealed, as well as countless silos that were aimed straight at the sky. Then, countless blazing flames lit up in the metal silos, bursting out with a roar and stirring up layers of air. Then, the scorching heat swept along with the hurricane. It pushed the heavy metal tree slowly into the sky. It was as if thousands of stars had shot into the sky in an instant, illuminating the dark world in an instant, revealing a magnificent and desolate silhouette and dull gray hue. Then, the thousands of stars silently flew into the distance. Just like the stars scattered in all directions. These messengers that symbolized peace did not have a single edge from top to bottom. Using a soft streamlined design, they did not carry the slightest hint of hostility. The three-stage jet design ensured that the copy would be delivered to the recipient as quickly as possible. On their outer shells were sealed matrices meticulously created by alchemists to preserve the laws and rules of physics from the present world. And in the inner space there was a gift from the host. Yes, a certain precious element that would release a green light that represented harmlessness and environmental protection. Even the corrosive species that did not know manners and civilization would be moved to tears after receiving this gift, right? Through such friendly greetings, everyone would establish friendship and bonds, then resolve misunderstandings, and live happily in this world together. It was as if they saw such a beautiful future waving at them. Everyone's lips couldn't help but curl into a smile. Wait a minute. Didn't you say that our war preparations are only at the standard level? This is the standard level, that's right. Fox replied calmly, wagging her tail. It's just that the standards of the Abyss Development Bureau are a little different from the standards of other departments. In the regulations of the Development Bureau, even if it was a standard-level war plan, it should be enough to fight a war of attrition with 3 times the number of abyssal civilizations with the same level of technology. If it was not for the fact that the laws of physics in the present world were gradually becoming difficult to apply as the depth decreased, and they had to rely on alchemy to maintain it, their reserves should be enough to send all of Australia to the sky. Chapter 366. Filled with sincere prayers for peace, the metal tree pierced through the sky with flames. Thousands of miles away, the spreading gray tide suddenly stopped. A resounding and sharp voice came from the depths of the gray tide, instantly suppressing all other noises. Even around the huge figure, ripples were instantly set off. Wherever the ripples passed, all the tiny mutants were forcefully shaken to death amidst the angry cries and were immediately devoured by their frenzied companions. Hunger wrapped around the consciousness of every beast, causing the mutants to fall into an endless frenzy. If not for the pressure from the leaders of the large group, they would probably have devoured each other first. Sensing the danger from afar, the leaders of the large group fell into a quarrel. But soon, the stagnant gray tide suddenly shook and set off 2 completely different waves, colliding with each other. The gray tide closed in from all sides. Then, the ground cracked and a thick tentacle stretched out, wrapping around the leader of the large group, who had advocated for retreat and abruptly closing in. Slurry splattered everywhere. Soon after, the tentacle retracted, allowing the gray tide to completely devour the dissidents. Soon, the gray tide that had paused moved forward again without any hesitation. In all directions there were constant cries and responses from the large group in the distance. One after another, the gray tide gradually dispersed, like a thin liquid, madly rushing forward amidst the incessant screams and cries of orders. Not long after, the metal tree fell from the sky. It was as if the stars were falling again. Amidst the rumbling, in the satellite observatory, Fox raised his binoculars and scrutinized the darkness in the distance. He only saw a sudden light in the endless darkness. The blazing heat quickly spread and rose, instantly tearing apart the seemingly eternal darkness, spewing out a vast amount of light and heat, as well as endless love and insignificant destruction. Destruction was planted into the soil like a seed, and soon, the fruit of destruction grew. It was too far away to hear the mournful cries of death and the loud rumbling, but he could feel the deep tremors coming from the ground in the distance. The tremors spread like ripples. As the seeds of destruction fell from the sky one after another, lush and solemn trees of flame grew from the ground one after another. Extremely cold and fanatical light adorned the tree trunk, while the dazzling radiation and gray-black clouds turned into its flowers and tree trunk. It covered the earth. As the rays spread out, the gray tide paused for a moment. Countless tiny fragments that were hard to see with the naked eye were thrown into the air by the hurricane and instantly evaporated in the horrifying high temperature. One after another, the gigantic silhouettes were burned to ashes and fell to the ground. The sky was scorching red like iron. The barren land glowed and sang aloud to the tune of extinction. How beautiful! The fox stared at the solemn scene through the telescope in a daze. His fur stood on end, and he was almost moved to tears. It was as if a distant dream had finally come true. On this day, the valley rose, the mountain fell, the bumpy road became a smooth road, and the holy light was revealed and illuminated the world. It was so immersed in this solemn scene that it did not notice the strange look on its companion's face and the distance between them. "Damn, your fetish is too weird, we can't talk about it." No matter how beautiful the scene was, one would eventually get tired of it. After watching for a while, Fox instructed the members of the observation post to compile a detailed casualty report for him before leaving via the satellite. There was still too much work for it to do. How much damage could the power of fission inflict on the enemy? In front of such a huge number and scale, even the energy of atoms gradually paled in comparison. This was just an appetizer. A greeting. There were more things that needed to be prepared. Time waits for no man, so it had to speed up. After the first salvo cleared all the stocks, a total of more than 900 reserves, the assembly line of the military factory began to operate rapidly. From that moment on, the Eternal Titan Empire maintained a firing rate of 1 rocket every half an hour, and each rocket was a standard yield of 5 million tons. The frame of the central silo needed to be replaced every hour, or the molten metal liquid on it would hinder the next launch. The smelting center was also operating at full capacity. Huaishur's dog head rotated between the 3 giant smelting furnaces that had just been built, working overtime around the clock. Accompanied by the howling hurricane, the atomic clock showed that in the evening of the second day, the destructive radiation cloud finally spread under the sweeping wind. Under the illumination of the searchlights, the black clouds were faintly tinged with dark green. A large amount of radioactive dust with high concentration of radiation was flying in the air, causing the Geiger counters around the city to start screaming crazily. If not for the increasingly thin air, they would have faced more than 100 times more pollution, right? But it didn't matter. The huge black stork rose from its peak and spread its wings. The thin air began to riot, and countless pale waves of air reverberated between heaven and earth. As it flew and circled, the thin air actually formed a calamity-grade storm. The violent wind violently pulled the radiation cloud, instantly pulling most of the dark green clouds into it and rapidly shrinking. Too slow, too slow. The giant stork cursed in dissatisfaction. Who asked him to be the one who was targeted the most by the environment? When he was deified, he chose the direction of controlling fluids, but now most of the fluids in the natural world had already disappeared. Not to mention the water source, even the air was almost gone. If not for the oxygen-producing equipment, perhaps the people in the Titan Empire would have suffocated to death. Without the air, its power lost its biggest application field, and it could only play a small role in some research and production. This was very annoying. But when it thought that there were people worse off than it began to gloat. "It's coming, open your mouth." As the wings suddenly closed, the storm of radiation dust that filled the sky suddenly turned into a beam, whistling toward the distance behind the city. There, a massive wolf head slowly rose up, opening its eyes that were as bright as the sun and the moon. Countless sharp teeth slowly rose, revealing a bottomless throat. Facing the storm flying toward it, it took a deep breath, and a huge amount of radiation dust was swallowed into Huaishur's stomach. Burp! Huaishur's nostrils spurted out 2 silver and dazzling ion jets, and then it sneezed, shaking its head as if nothing had happened, and shouted at the top of its voice, "Is there more?" Then, the air riot, and only a low voice crazily echoed in the roar of thunder. More, 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 more. Countless dust rose up, dancing wildly in panic. As if it had been hit by a sonic cannon, the giant stork staggered in the air, almost falling down. Then, it couldn't help but roll its eyes. Damn, why is it another pervert? No more! Why sure smacked its lips, as if it hadn't had enough. It lay down again and whispered to the construction team on its back, "You can continue." Then, the busy construction continued. The construction started around yesterday morning. Fox, who had left and returned, came looking for Huaisher. He looked at the huge frame that had just been installed on Huaisher's back, pondered for a long time, and said that he had a plan. "Look, your body shape and your ability to bear weight, as well as the frame that had just been put on your back," Fox praised. "You're simply a natural cannon frame." "Sorry, I'm only 17, I don't know what you're talking about." Huaisher opened his eyes wide in shock, looking at Fox with an expression that said, "Uncle, you're a pervert." It almost made Fox spit out a mouthful of old blood, and he jumped up in anger. "What do you not know? You're only 17, how can you even dare to drive Uncle's car? And why do you drive even more smoothly than Uncle?" "I'm not joking." Fox choked and coughed for a long time, then said with wide eyes, "I'm talking about the literal meaning." "Oh." Huaisher stared blankly for a long time, then let out a sigh of relief. "I thought you had some unspeakable evil thoughts towards me." Fox was about to die from anger. "No matter how sick I am, I won't go so far as to make a move on you. You're only 17, what are you thinking in your head every day? Hooking up with a rich woman?" Huaisher answered subconsciously, then immediately coughed awkwardly. "Ah, that's none of my business. Recently everyone has been saying that you're a pervert." Well, the ignorant child Huaisher bluntly exposed the gossip behind the adult's back, making Fox's expression twitch faster and faster. "I'm not." "Oh, it doesn't matter if you are." Huaisher decisively stopped the topic, then asked, "What did you want to say just now? Cannon rack? Don't you King mention that word, okay?" Fox was about to vomit blood. "In short, there will be a construction team coming to find you later, to modify the fixed frame on your back, and then a lot of heavy weapons will be installed on your body. With your ability to bear weight, it shouldn't be a problem, and then you'll be our artillery base." After saying that, he was afraid that Huaisher would say something else, so he turned around and left. "Oh, to be everyone's cannon rack, I know." Huaisher nodded seriously, then shouted at him confidently, "I'll work hard." Fox's back staggered, and he almost rolled down the road. Thanks to Huaisher's loud voice, before that night, everyone knew that the pervert Fox had gone to find a 17-year-old boy to talk about something that children shouldn't hear, and even had some unspeakable evil thoughts. The phoenix silently looked at Fox for a long time, its eyes sad and helpless. After a long time it sighed, "Old Wu, I've known you for so many years, but I didn't expect you to be such a person." I'm not. I won't say anything more. When we get out, you can go and submit the self-reflection letter yourself." It seemed that it couldn't bear to say anything more, so it covered its face and left. Fox was left standing alone in the bleak vacuum, looking down at the ground below the city wall, and began to think, "If I jump down from here, can I redeem my innocence?" Chapter 367. Starting from the second day after the metal tree rose into the sky, in the lonely darkness, apart from the constant flashes of destruction in the distance, there was a rumbling sound. It came from outside the city. Apart from the countless loud sounds of steel rubbing and colliding, there were only specks of light moving on the black iron like stars. Those were the brief flashes of light that burst forth when the huge welding torch moved. 16 large-scale furnaces operated 24 hours a day, emptying 1/3 of the city's metal reserves and 80% of its production capacity. Coupled with the inconceivable abilities of the Ultralisks, in the end, Layers upon layers of steel armor glowing with starry blue evenly covered Bichimo's body. It gave the mountain-like ultralisks an invincible armor. It was rough and precise, as though an entire metal city wall and war fortress were carefully hung on Huaishi's body. Even the rainbow-colored RGB holy light behind him glowed with a trace of metallic light. The sharp edges and corners of the armor radiated the destruction created by human ingenuity. Radiation. After unceremoniously swallowing all the radioactive dust, the nuclear radiation on Huaishi's body was frighteningly high. After being probed by instruments, it was discovered that 8 huge reaction sources had spontaneously formed in his body. It was as though 8 nuclear power plants had been stuffed into his body. But it seemed as though nothing had happened to him. Apart from the addition of a pile of uranium ore to his daily diet, there was no abnormality at all. His life was incredibly tough. It's one thing for him to suddenly evolve into a reactor-like organ, but why can he even refine reaction rods on his own? Isn't this a little too much of a foul? The scholars in charge of engineering scrutinized the behemoth that they could not see the end of. Their eyes sparkled. "Can I study it for a while?" Huaishi grinned. He raised his paw and welded an iron card with the symbol of a full member and stuck it on Bichimo's head. The 8th one. It was not as though no one had ever done an analysis of Huaishi. In fact, he had already been thoroughly analyzed from inside out on the 2nd day after his arrival. Only then did they discover that his evolutionary system, from the very beginning, was not the same as all the biological systems in the present realm. Although it was based on the biological template of the modern realm, it had more characteristics with obvious traces of hell. In other words, it was an erosive species. That's right. If the corrosive seed was a threat, then the biggest corrosive seed in the entire Night of the Witch was right next to them. Moreover, it ate and drank their food 5 times a day and even helped them forge iron and steel. It was hard to say what kind of spirit this was, but Fox and the others were indeed scared to death. What was even more unbelievable was that its structure was completely different from other creatures. No, it should be said that it wasn't even considered a creature anymore. What is this? It was a moving piece of metal, steel, a moving furnace, and a dormant volcano. It was a monster that could deal with the apocalypse just by relying on its body size. It did not conform to the current laws of biology, nor did it follow all the laws that ordinary people knew. It was like a fairy tale that existed in the void. However, he walked out of his own story and came here, appearing in front of everyone. It was inconceivable. Even the creators in the outside world fell into silence. This was not a difference in performance and function, nor was there a difference in conception and creativity. It was that the starting point was completely different from theirs from the beginning. The creator behind Huaishi did not create a living behemoth. What he sought was not rigorous scholarship that could be successfully replicated and falsified. He did not even consider whether the laws and regulations he weaved could be realized after leaving the unique environment of the Night of the Witch. Instead, he used the entire Night of the Witch as a stage. After all this was a trial performance, he created a character at will. He did not consider cause and effect, nor did he consider any elements that had nothing to do with his inspiration. He willfully wrote, cutting and correcting reality as he pleased. In the end, he extracted countless elements that he liked and buried them in the soil of reality, allowing them to grow wantonly. He did not ask for anything in return, did not care about the consequences, and did not expect anything else. It was a goal in itself. It was the answer written by the unknown creator, a story that was told with a burst of inspiration. Apart from the former utopia, was there anyone else who could be so proficient in the operation of the situation? Other than that group of lunatics who pursued a perfect world, where else would have such naive ideas and arrogant ideas? The creators in the outside world had once called the ivory tower to inquire, but the response they received was, without exception, silence or ambiguous responses. They did not deny it, but they also did not admit that any professor had participated in this Night of the Witch. However, there was no doubt that Huai Shi could be regarded as the work of the Utopia. In order to welcome the return of this deceased colleague, those pioneers who had come to the end came here and invested in works of the same origin as her. This was their unique way of commemoration. And now, as hundreds of giant tower cranes were retracted, countless supports collapsed. Amidst the tremors of the earth, Huai Shi slowly got up and stretched his body slightly. The ear-piercing roar of steel friction burst forth. Dazzling sparks burst out from the gaps of the armor. As Huai Shi's movements became more violent, the earth quaked even more violently. Over his body, heavy steel blocks kept peeling off from the friction and collision, leaving no one able to stop him. But when the flying steel chips slowly fell, the armored steel behemoth was completely different from before. It was not just a difference in form, but as if it was welcoming another metamorphosis. At this point, as Huai Shi breathed, a vast amount of origin substance flowed between the armor and his body, connecting the welded steel to his body so that there was no distinction between the two. Layers of scale-like patterns appeared over the flat armor, like the tendons and muscles left by a craftsman during forging. It was solemn, majestic, and so sharp that one could not look directly at it. In front of Huai Shi, the scholar on the tower could not help but take a few steps back, gulping dryly. Under the suppression of that ferocious presence, there was actually a hint of panic and regret in his heart. It was the doubt and uneasiness that would surface in the hearts of countless research fanatics when they sensed that the situation was not quite right. Was everything he was doing still under his control? If the present Huai Shi showed the slightest hostility, the Eternal Titan Empire would probably be reduced to ruins before the other behemoths could defeat him, even without the invasion of the corrosive species. He subconsciously wanted to touch the alarm button. Taking a deep breath, he raised the microphone and asked rather dryly, "How do you feel?" Amidst the uneasy silence, the giant amber eyes looked down at his present body. Huai Shi grinned, revealing the most beautiful evil smile in movies and TV series, causing the scholar's heart to abruptly sink. Then, his heart really did sink. Because Huai Shi said, "My butt is itchy. I want to scratch it. Can you take this thing apart first?" The scholar's expression twitched, and he looked at him in astonishment, with a blank look on his face. "Are you kidding, brother? It took more than 600 people and thousands of automatic machines 48 hours to put on this armor for you. How long have you been wearing it and you want to take it off? Ha ha ha, you're scared, aren't you?" Huai Shi laughed proudly, pointed at him, then shook his head and said, "I'm kidding. Well, although it's a little itchy, I can scratch it myself." As he said that, he lifted his sharp and heavy tail and scratched the scholar's butt vigorously, causing a burst of blazing and dazzling sparks. Before the scholar could say anything, he heard his voice, "All of you, move back a little. The momentum will be a little louder later. Don't hurt anyone." So, soon, with the sharp sound of the alarm, all the evolved species in the construction site took the big bus and ran dozens of kilometers away. Then, they saw that as Huai Shi took a deep breath, traces of electric light emerged from his body again. In the blink of an eye, violent icy blue flashes shrouded his body, bursting out with his roar. In the countless low buzzing sounds like the buzzing of bees, a thick pillar of thunder suddenly rose from his body and soared into the sky. The thunder turned into a pillar of heaven, and the fanatical light of destruction illuminated this crazy world. It tore through the darkness and broke through the air in all directions, coldly lashing out at this world. The terrifying power was hundreds of times more than before. Just by slightly activating his own talent, it caused such a terrifying momentum. This terrifying increase did not come from Huai Shi himself, but from the tens of thousands of complicated and huge Doomsday magnetic field engines under his armor at this moment. The careful design of the scholars had increased Huaishi's own destructive power to a level that even he himself could not imagine. However, this was not to kill the enemy, but to recharge the thousands of alchemy cannons on Huaishi's back that needed to be loaded by the train to be transported. There were 4 main cannons on the left and right rear, more than 80 secondary cannons, and thousands of secondary cannons installed in the center of the circuit to provide diversion. Today, Huaishi had become the strongest weapon of the Titan Empire, a mobile war fortress, an upgraded version of the war machine. Do you know? Huaishi stretched his body happily, sniffing the thin air that was gradually getting thicker, as if he had caught a glimpse of the gray tide roaring from thousands of miles away. I'm actually starting to hope that they can come sooner. Chapter 368. It was noon on the 4th day. There was no scorching sun in the dark sky, nor was there a magnificent scene of a cloudless sky above the parched land. There was only the sound of waves gradually coming from afar. It was a low echo formed by countless tiny and noisy sounds overlapping in one place. It came from all directions, as if it was covering the sky and the earth. Under the illumination of the lone star, even the steel city of the Titan Empire became turbulent. But then, a series of sharp friction sounds burst forth. Viscous oil rushed through the layers of pipes, and with the huge pressure of the pistons, hundreds of thousands of hydraulic pumps operated with a loud rumble. They actually uniformly propped up the entire city by more than a meter. Under the control of the giant stork, a liquid buffer layer was rapidly forming through the entire city, supporting it between the steel city and the earth. It feels like a latex mattress. Huaishi glanced at it and was a little eager to try. He wanted to roll on it, but was hurriedly stopped by the undying bird. Forget it, let's not be in a hurry to play. After this is over, I'll ask Old Wu to make one for you. Right, Old Wu? Right. The fox with 2 dark circles under its eyes lifted its head listlessly and nodded numbly. It felt that it was already mentally and physically exhausted from the social death. In fact, although it caused some misunderstandings due to its improper use of words, it did not last long. Everyone just wanted to feign ignorance and seize this rare opportunity to persecute him. After all, this guy had made many people suffer in silence before. This time, they finally had the chance to see him make a fool of himself. How could they not seize the opportunity to fan the flames and add oil to the fire? The fox could only admit that it was unlucky, and did not even have the thought of revenge. Huaishi did not look like a good target for revenge. A 17-year-old giant husky did not know how to swallow insult. Once angered, its destructive power was so great that it could give people nightmares. So, forget it. At least it still had a sense of the big picture. But whether or not it would make things difficult for a 17-year-old military officer after it went out, well, that was hard to say. The reason why it looked so haggard was that it was the result of working overtime. In these 4 days, not only was he unable to rest due to the busy preparation work, but he had also activated his innate skill countless times. It was as if a supercomputer could overheat. Now the entire fox was dispirited, and its fur had become curly and dry. Now, as the gray tide gradually approached, everyone's expression became solemn and no longer spoke. In the darkness, only Huaishi's body lit up with electric currents. They were dazzling and dazzling, constantly sinking into the towering iron tower behind him. At this moment, he looked like a marionette. Streaks of dark blue lightning constantly flashed between his joints and the iron tower, leaving streaks of afterimages in the darkness. Just by getting close, he could feel the huge electrostatic field prickling his skin and hair. "How's the charging progress?" the Phoenix asked. "Not bad." Huaishi shook his head. "The resistance is still too high. Although it can theoretically reach 150%, after reaching 120%, the speed of power loss is almost catching up with the speed of my charging. Other than a burst of power, there's not much use. That being said, The electricity carried by Huaishur at this moment was not inferior to a large thunderstorm. Once released at such a close distance, all the large facilities in the entire Titan Empire would be forced to close down in this terrible impact. But hasn't the technology been updated these 2 days? Why do we still need to use electricity? Huaishur asked curiously. I heard that many borders within the Astronomical Society have already adopted more advanced energy sources. Why haven't I seen it in the present realm? Because electricity is the most convenient. The maintenance engineer leading the team on Huaishur's back replied through the communication. Although the most advanced technology used in the present realm today is nuclear fission reactors to obtain electricity in addition to primitive firepower, wind power, and water power, in fact, in the frontier experiments of scholars, it's not just nuclear fusion and nuclear fusion at room temperature. Even the relevant laws of vacuum zero-point energy have begun to be explored. There are about 7 or 8 types of energy sources more advanced than electricity. The places you mentioned should be independent institutions that have a high energy demand but are not suitable for long-term communication with the outside world. For a series of reasons such as confidentiality or internal security, they have to get rid of their dependence on the outside world, so they use other energy sources. These examples are not applicable to the present realm. In the classification of energy science today, the most perfect, stable, and trustworthy is still electrodynamics, which has been developed for nearly 600 years. Every detail of electrodynamics has been revised by generations of scholars and creators to the greatest extent to conform to the 3 major blockade. After the 4 fundamental forces are established, it has even achieved the mutual transformation of electricity and the past magic to a certain extent. The maintenance of the present realm is a law that if hastily written into other energy sources, once there are conflicts in the details of the regulations, it might lead to unexpected tragic situations. If there are too many strange mods that are incompatible, Little Butter will collapse, right? Huaishur nodded and tried to understand the situation from a strange perspective. She suddenly realized something. I understand now. On his back, the engineer who was climbing the tower almost slipped and fell from above. He did not catch his breath, and his pale green goblin face turned red. Evil creature, what do you understand now? But before he could reply, an ear-piercing alarm sounded from the sky, and the pale light of the steel satellite instantly turned blood-red. In the shrill sound of the air defense alarm, emergency shelters sounded from all over the city. If it were any other place, in the face of such a hasty alarm, it would definitely cause a great commotion, right? But in the metal city, everyone was like layers of gears embedded together, moving quickly and orderly, full of the beauty of machinery. For the explorers, the tribe they developed was no different from their own hands, eyes, and feet. No matter where the tribe was and what situation they were in, they would unconditionally obey the orders of the tribe leader, even if the orders were cruel, heartless, or contrary to nature. Under the command of the central control, all the members orderly entered the shelters or war fortifications in batches, using transportation, elevators, and even walking. They were on standby. It's here. The 6-winged, undying bird suddenly spread its wings and soared into the air. Hanging high in the sky, it emitted boundless light. In the blink of an eye, a fleeting sun appeared in this world, illuminating every inch of land and darkness. It revealed the gray tide that was sweeping from the distance. Huaishur had expected the gray tide to slowly flood over, but what he saw now was completely different from what he had imagined. The earth was shaking and roaring. The rumbling of trillions of corrosive species turned into the loud rumble of the tide. But it did not look like seawater, but like a rapidly growing carpet rolling over the land, seemingly slow but actually swift as thunder. Looking into the distance, there was no end in sight. All that could be seen were huge silhouettes slowly emerging from the depths of the gray tide, and ferocious limbs dancing. Countless blood-red eyes, like bubbles on the seawater, flowers that grew out of fungus after the rain, kept emerging from the tide of the abyss. Every corrosive species, big or small, was already emaciated under the torture of hunger and desolation, and looked as if they would fall dead on the spot. But now there was a fanatical light in their eyes. Countless scarlet eyes gathered in one place, and Huai Shi could not help but shudder. He finally understood what it was like to be the enemy of the entire hell. But there was no one to thank for the invitation. Wait a minute. The undying bird's deep voice sounded in the ears of every giant beast. Suppressing the ferocity of the giant beasts deep in their blood, it said, "Wait a little longer." Huai Shi took a deep breath, and terrifying heat gushed out from the gap under the armor. In an instant it turned into an oven in the darkness. Blue flames kept emerging from his mouth and nose, bursting out. The undying bird's deep voice continued, echoing between heaven and earth, covering the terrifying tide from afar. "Don't worry, it's not time yet," it said, "so we have to wait." Even if the earth rumbled, the gray tide had already entered within 100 miles. Looking down from the sky, the huge steel capital was as small as a speck of dust, and the dark tide in all directions could not see the end. Such a huge disparity brought about a piercing sense of crisis that made all the giant beasts wander on the edge of madness. His eyes burned brightly, bursting with a blazing light. Wait a little longer. A golden halo like a sun appeared around the undying bird's body, restraining the endless flames in its body. It was a cruel power that seemed to be born from the essence of thermodynamics. When the gray tide was close and within 10 miles, a sharp sound like the roar of steel burst out from the deepest part of the city. It was a signal from the central control room. In the shortest way, in the most straightforward and efficient way. The roar of the cannon, the prelude to the war, was opened at that moment. There was no need for anyone to urge. The roar of the giant beasts burst out from the earth, and the sound of tearing the tide turned into thunder and soared into the sky. The six-winged undying bird was faster than everyone else. At this moment, the giant bird, who usually looked no different from the other members, was already at the top of the sky. It was as if he was sitting on his own throne. 16 golden halos emerged from his body, and the power from the essence of thermodynamics burst out from his 6 wings. The intense light instantly spread in all directions, covering everything within hundreds of miles. Then, a tyrannical heat emerged from the light, and in an instant, all the invaders were turned into ashes. It was like a high-temperature spray gun burning away an insignificant hair, and not even ashes were left. As the earth cracked, the soil was also burned, turning into a fiery red slurry that flowed everywhere. The sun that had not been seen for a long time once again came to this hell, but this time, it did not bestow kindness to all living beings, but a terrible disaster of light that burned everything to ashes. There was no need for others to do anything. Under exquisite control, the terrible heat did not even hurt a single ally. The radiance disappeared as soon as it was released. Immediately, the world was plunged into darkness again. After a brief setback, the endless gray tide only paused for a moment before it swept forward again. Thus, the sun spread out again. The flames of destruction swept through the surroundings, and the destruction fell again, shrinking back into the corona. The gray tide went deeper and deeper, and the sun spread out again. The tyrannical and huge power seemed to be endless. Not only were the leaders hidden in the gray tide stunned, but even the allies were already stunned. What kind of operation is this? The Taurus was dumbfounded. He only said to make others wait, but he is collecting heads himself. Where did this malignant tumor come from? After 10 times, the flames swept across the earth like a plow, completely turning the area within 1,000 miles into a scorching hell of raging lava. At this moment, the undying bird was still hanging high above the steel city, sprinkling light and illuminating the entire battlefield, continuously replenishing the heat of the lava. However, the terrible power that swept through the acupoints like a plow just now did not appear again. It seemed to have reached its limit, but it also seemed like it had not. No one could see any clues from his unfathomable eyes. He was only spreading the most basic heat to maintain this infernal inferno that was thousands of miles wide. That was enough for him. In the endless gray tide, more than 60% of the corrosive species were weak and dying. They could not resist the heat from the undying bird at all, and were burned to ashes as soon as they entered, turning into firewood in hell. In other words, just the undying bird alone was enough to withstand 60% of the trillions of corrosive species. The rest is up to you. The calm voice of the undying bird rang in the ears of every explorer. I will support you at any time. At this moment, the calm and deep voice gave everyone endless confidence. It was as if they really had to lean against the sun. Their fighting spirit was aroused. And what was faster than their words were the wild dogs that had broken free of their reins. Amidst the sudden rumbling of the earth, hurricanes howled and swept across the land, setting off waves of lava that were several stories tall. Bichimos, its 4 legs trampling on the flames, had already dashed out. It roared excitedly at the sky, "Hey! I want to eat a hot dog!" Chapter 369. Hungry. Hungry. If one had to describe it, it would be super unparalleled hunger. For the first time, Huaishur felt such an urgent and strong sense of hunger after completing the deification transformation. It was as if he had not eaten for 10 years. He could indeed eat stones, iron ore, and molten iron without any problems, but how could that kind of non-nutritious cornbread compare to barbecued meat? At this moment, someone was continuously barbecuing a whole lamb, a whole cow, a whole kidney, a large intestine, and a squid tentacle in front of him. Although there was still a little cumin missing, there was already an internal taste. Smelling the burnt aroma from afar, Huaishur's saliva had already left his mouth. He could not wait. After seeing the undying bird collect so many heads, the desire to fight in his blood did not emerge. Instead, a strong sense of admiration rose. Someone had actually set up a barbecue rack for him. What was he waiting for? Go, go, go! The cafeteria was ready to eat. Huaishur dashed forward wildly, ignoring the oncoming black tide. He ran straight toward the huge figure in the gray tide, the corrosive species that looked like a giant wild boar. It was as if he was not looking at an enemy, but a roasted hot dog with 4 legs. What appeared on his face was not ferocious and murderous, but an appetite that made the corrosive species shudder. Seeing him running toward it with his tongue and saliva, the giant wild boar paused and almost instinctively wanted to run back. However, the gray tide was turbulent and pushed it forward. It could not run away. As for Huaishur, she was getting closer and closer when it turned back. The ferocity and hunger had disappeared, replaced by a strong sense of despair in its eyes. "Don't come over." Then, Huaishur came over, trampling on the gray tide under his feet. He bent down, grabbed the beast that was as big as a small mountain, lifted it, and threw it into the air. Then, he opened his mouth and closed it with a howl. It was just enough for one bite. He felt the delicious gravy burst out of his mouth. The fatty and sweet pork mixed with the lava juice burst out with a stunning and wonderful taste. Huaishur was almost moved to tears. When he lowered his head again, he realized that the sea of gray corrosive species that was everywhere like a tidal wave had suddenly parted to form a huge gap in front of him. It was as if they had encountered an invisible obstacle. The moment they saw Huaishur, they ran wildly to the sides, then gathered behind him and ran forward. "I don't want to play with him anymore. What should I do?" Huaishur was dumbfounded. I seemed to be isolated. No one spoke to him. They were too lazy to bother with him. "You can't afford to play, right?" Huaishur was furious. On the back of the armor, countless huge cannons stood upright and aimed in all directions. "2nd Battalion Commander, fire!" "I'll say it again. I'm not your F*** King 2nd Battalion Commander. a terrifying electric current suddenly rose from the top of the tower, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws in the air, converging into a faint shadow of a thundercloud. It was the Taurus constellation that had already transformed into energy. Then, a ferocious smile appeared on the thundercloud. "But I have no objections to firing the cannons." At that moment, the ground under Huaishi's feet suddenly shook. He was smashed down dozens of meters by the huge recoil. The ground cracked, and his 4 huge claws were almost buried in the soil. Thousands of streaks of light had already gushed out along with the frenzied thunder, rising and falling like stars. The origin substance turned into heavy metal, instantly ejecting and accelerating wildly in the thousands of electromagnetic fields, reaching a terrifying speed that was difficult for the naked eye to follow. The moment they left the chamber, their terrifying size began to rapidly vaporize, leaving behind glaring traces of metal steam wherever they passed. The sharp cannonballs had already pierced into the tide, leaving behind radiating traces that extended hundreds of kilometers into the gray tide. The corrosive species that were hit by the cannonballs nearby vaporized before they could even wail. In the middle distance, they would explode into a rain of blood and be torn apart by the wind, forming a scarlet mist in the silver metal steam. On the other hand, the unlucky ones furthest away had huge wounds dug out of their bodies. Shortly after, the metal shards in their wounds exploded, disintegrating into the purest metal mist. Half of their bodies were instantly charred, and they collapsed to the ground. Huaishi stepped forward and roared at the sky. Blazing lightning rose again, converging into the tower continuously. Under the control of the Taurus constellation, it was evenly and quickly distributed to every giant cannon that had been preheated. 1/3 was cooling, 1/3 was preparing, and 1/3 was preheating. It was simply a reproduction of the 3-stage shooting style of the era of queuing and shooting. With the support of almost unlimited firepower, the moving cannon formation rumbled forward. Step by step, they walked out of the range of the lava, charging into the depths of the gray tide. When Huaishi felt tired, he would breathe and gulp down the sediment from the abyss. When he was thirsty, he would open his mouth and receive the rain of blood that kept falling from the sky. The aura of the abyss, which made the leaders of a large group pale in comparison, emerged from his body, almost causing people to mistake him for the same kind. But now, the biggest traitor in the Night of the Witch was ready to kill his own kind. On his back, the cannon formation constantly changed its position, completely ignoring the small fries around it, and began to focus on the huge threats in the gray tide. The effect was outstanding. This was Huaishi's mission. Using his own strong resistance to hell, he broke away from the group to attract the attention of the enemy to the greatest extent, relieving the pressure on his allies in the defense circle. In other words, he was a target. But other than Huaishi, who was as huge as a mountain, whose armor was so thick that even cannons could not penetrate it, and whose life was so tough that he would not die even if the end of the world came, who else could complete such a mission? What's more, there was a teammate with the strongest explosive power assisting from the side. At this moment, the completely electrified Taurus was constantly flying from the huge tower behind Huaishi, falling into the metal city, and then wrapped in a huge amount of electric current in the energy furnace, returning again and starting a new round of crazy output. Instant spring water, instant mana, and skills without cooldown. It was like cheating. For it, there was no problem of the burden of the other behemoths. It itself was energy. In other words, as long as it was willing, it could even hit itself out. Under the unlimited supply of the 6 reactors in the central city, it had been a long time since it used its power so heartily. Even after being sleepy for a long time, it became a little drunk. It fell into a state of excitement and madness. Oh, I'm the Lightning King. Surrounded by dozens of crazy thunderbolts, the snake-shaped electric current wrapped around the huge tower laughed wildly and scattered destruction. Accept Uncle Bull's correction. Speaking of which, you're not a bull at all, are you? Why are you called Taurus? Huai Shi was running amok in the crowd of monsters, even having the time to turn back and chat. It's just that after using the ecliptic prototype of creator Kingirtai, it's called Taurus. It's just a code name, it doesn't matter what you're called. Huai Shi's eyes widened and asked angrily, then why can't I be called 2nd Battalion Commander? Taurus was also stunned for a moment, and was a little embarrassed, and immediately retorted irritably, anyway, you can't. Okay. Huai Shi pursed her lips. Our independent regiment only has 2 people. I don't have any objections to you being the commander of the 1st Battalion. But let me say this first, I can't give my position as regiment commander to you. Do I care? Taurus felt that if it had not been energy transformed long ago, it would have been so angry that it would have vomited blood. Also, be careful in front. Huai Shi was stunned and suddenly turned back, feeling the thin air suddenly ripple, and a giant snake full of barbs and eyes suddenly rushed out of the gray tide, its huge body pouncing towards him. Huai Shi only had time to take a deep breath. And then the giant snake was gone. After being evenly smeared with a layer of metal steam and heated up, it was turned into charcoal grilled snake segments, crispy and rich. Huai Shi finished eating, and only felt that the Taurus next door was crying. I didn't. Taurus was furious. How did you know what I was thinking? I beg you, turn off the free mic. Taurus was completely helpless. We're still on the same channel, can't you stop thinking? Why didn't you say so earlier? I would have cut the song. Huai Shi's eyes lit up, and he switched to the public channel, turned on the colorful backlight behind him, and simply set the BGM in his heart, singing and dancing hot, and dancing in the gray tide. So, in the harsh noise pollution, everyone began to feel that there was nothing left to live for in the rich orchard atmosphere. Fortunately, as Huai Shi went deeper and deeper, the mental pollution was getting farther and farther away, and he could use his subjective will to block it and pretend that he could not hear it. But even if Huai Shi ran forward with all his strength for half an hour, and even if he could run back to Pingan County from Zhaozhuang by walking, he still could not see the end of the gray tide. The whole world seemed to be drowned by the erosion seed. If it were not for the sun hanging high behind him, he would almost be lost in this eternal gray and black disturbance. Even the irascible Taurus could not help but feel a trace of powerlessness. How many have we killed? 1,000? 10,000? 100,000? Huai Shi couldn't even calculate how many enemies she could kill with a single round of cannon fire, but even after being bombarded with nuclear bombs for days on end, the number of enemies was still endless. It was as if there was no end to them. And as Huai Shi went deeper, in the depths of the gray tide, a ferocious silhouette finally slowly emerged. A half-rotten giant bird rose from the darkness, condensing its own fleeting silhouette like a mist of nothingness, and as the single wing, which was full of tumors and aberrations, slowly rose, it gave people the illusion that it covered the whole world. After the gray tide, the master of the swarm finally appeared. He made a prompt decision and fired a round of artillery fire. However, when the hot metal cannonballs landed on its wings, they only added an insignificant layer of molten iron to its dull gray feathers. As the wings shook, the iron liquid was shaken off like water. Then, behind and to the right of Huai Shi, 2 huge figures that seemed to be condensed by the darkness appeared, slowly moving forward, trying to surround him. Be careful, they want to keep us here. Taurus looked around and reminded in a low voice. Let's retreat first and bring back information about them. If we get entangled by them, we might be exhausted to death. Huai Shi had a different opinion about this. You have to think positively. He swallowed his saliva and stared at the giant shadow bird in the distance. As he spread his arms, the hymn sounded again. The hammer of misery was raised again, excitedly aiming at the stunned master of the swarm. At least I have enough chicken wings. Bichimos shouted excitedly, a roar burst forth. The buffet of the abyss had begun. Chapter 370. It was clearly a raging gray tide, but at this moment, a deathly silence suddenly descended. Under the murderous intent between the leaders of the large groups, all living things were intimidated and retreated in fear. But at this moment, under the encirclement of the three leaders of the large groups, the prey did not panic or struggle as expected. It was so strange. With the wisdom bestowed by the abyss, it could clearly distinguish that the appearance at this moment was not one of fear, seriousness, or battle intent. It just calmly raised its hammer, as if it was raising a table knife. It was full of gratitude for the food. "Are you ready?" The wolf beast grinned and smiled. A dangerous aura spread from the burst of electric light. In an instant, the three leaders of the large groups could not help but become cautious and ready for battle. Even the Taurus did not expect him to be so stubborn. He only remembered to shout, "Hey, don't," but then they heard a roar. A loud noise burst forth. It was as if the sky was falling and the earth was splitting. Huaishur disappeared from where he was, as if he had evaporated. Then, the thin air also wailed, bursting with thunder under the whip of electric light. The shadow of a mountain had already shrouded the face of the giant shadow bird. Against the fanatical electric light, the wolf beast smiled mockingly and raised the hammer in his hand. "Whether you are ready or not," it said, "I am ready." Boom! With terrifying speed, unparalleled pain and weight operated in the hands of Bichimos. With a violent swing, it smashed downwards without any fancy moves. The sky fell. Since becoming Bichimos, this was the first time Huaishur used the technique of use-step. Its body, which was originally so huge and cumbersome, was now as agile as a phantom. In an instant it crossed a distance of several kilometers. As if descending from the sky, it arrived in front of the shadow crow. It raised its hammer and smashed downwards. There was no need for any other moves or technique. As long as he put all his strength, as long as he put all his weight on this hammer, it would be enough. That was enough. Again, with the dazzling plasma jets spurting out, mournful lightning wrapped around the hammer the size of an office building, causing the falling steel to accelerate, and accelerate again. It tore through layers of darkness and smashed on the single wing that it had hurriedly raised. It was as if he had crushed a bubble. He easily smashed the wings that he had raised, breaking them into two pieces. Then, he continued to descend with irresistible force. In the middle of the stunned beast's face, the wail of bones breaking could be heard, followed by a series of wails from the spinal cord and an unbearable explosion. When the loud sound spread out, countless clouds of dust were stirred up. Strands of violent electric light tore through the darkness, illuminating the tragic silhouette. Under the bombardment of the hammer, it had already tilted up like a broken piece of wood. Its head was deeply buried in the cracks of the ground, and its twitching body stood upright, still convulsing in pain. Immediately after, Bichimos raised his foot and stomped on it. He stretched out his hand and a teeth-numbing tearing sound rang out. It tore off its giant wings and opened its mouth to spit out flames, instantly cooking it. Huaishur tossed it into his mouth and chewed it twice before spitting out the burnt feathers. He smacked his lips and pondered for a moment before spitting disdainfully. Mediocre. Taurus could feel the non-existent corners of his eyes twitching. He couldn't help but say, "It's already smashed into meat paste. The taste can't be good no matter how you think about it." "That's true." Huaishur nodded seriously. He waved his hand to disperse the hammer of agony and pulled out the axe of wrath and the sacrificial blade. The blades scraped against each other, causing sparks to burst out amidst the teeth-numbing metallic sound. In the fleeting flash, he grinned at the remaining two prey. "I'll be more careful next time." In that instant, the remaining two huge corrosive species involuntarily took a step back. They saw the astonishment, unconcealable fear and dread in each other's eyes. Behind them, in the direction of the metal city, a crimson light suddenly rose. "Stop fooling around, Huaishur. It's a distress signal." Taurus' tone turned serious. Huai Shi stared blankly for a moment before he resentfully put away his axe. Okay, I'll go now. No, I mean hurry up. Huai Shi raised his eyebrows happily and whistled at the two corrosive species. I'll try my best. The gray tide seemed to be about to drown the city. Even the giant beasts were helpless against the endless numbers. At this moment, layers of ice-cold water curtains rose, enveloping the entire city in defense. But above the vault of heaven, there was also an endless gray tide. They were flying birds, flying in flocks like termites preying on food. They were a tide of disaster that constantly flew out from the shattered clouds. The winged serpent was already entangled with the undying bird. Even in the gray tide, this strange giant beast was at the forefront. It constantly shuttled through space, flickering and jumping out. Poisonous clouds were emitted from its body, covering most of the sky and sprinkling down the fierce poison of the abyss. In the heavy encirclement, the shadow of a 9-headed serpent slowly rose above the metal city. Its 9 heads hissed, and its huge body emitted astonishing waves of origin substance. Immediately after, a storm of steel fell from the sky. Wherever the slender and sharp cold light passed, even the giant serpent's sturdy body, which was strong enough to resist the sun wheel, was pierced through. Under the origin substance, countless strange runes appeared on the sharp metal, causing the steel to retract into spear-like nails. They gathered in groups like piranhas and shuttled through the battlefield. Ashnail? Fox, who was watching from the top of the city wall, put down his binoculars and was dumbfounded. The thousands of cold metallic lights were formed by countless relics from the border. The sharp blades carried the invincible blessing and the curse of the bloody soul double kill. The miracle from the depths of hell reappeared here. Among the 4,100 formulas announced so far, it was the vicious weapon ranked 11th among the cursed blades, the ash nail. At this moment, more than tens of thousands had been refined by Hydra. Even if it was incomparable to the divine power of the main body, as an ordinary mass-produced model, it still displayed an unimaginably terrifying effect at this moment. As expected of Garland Dion's disciple, Fox exclaimed from the bottom of his heart. Other than forging miracle stigmata and magic potions in the furnace, what alchemists were best at was the reappearance of the disaster of the abyss at this moment. Currently, there were already more than 4,000 formulas of relics from the border that had been announced for all alchemists to pay for. It was like rubbing, using the prototype as the basis and carrying out mass-produced replicas. Even if it could only be preserved for a short period of time, it was still a great undertaking that could recreate miracles. However, to refine tens of thousands of ash nail in one go, no matter how powerful a genius was, they would still be drained of their origin substance, right? If it wasn't for the body of a giant beast at this moment, Goliath would have been completely drained and burned to ashes by the third time. Tens of thousands of ash-returning nails whizzed across the battlefield. Wherever the metal hurricane passed by, everything was cleanly crushed, turning into ashes that filled the sky. At the same time, the dual attack and extermination targeted the physical body and origin substance. The wounds caused by them couldn't be healed at all. Even if they didn't die, they would turn into ashes in the continuous loss of blood and origin substance. Everything turned to ashes. It was as if the world had been burned to ashes. The storm of steel swept through like a plow, and the gray tide was cruelly overturned. Countless ashes flew out, rising from the magma hurricane and turning into dancing flames. Cracking sounds constantly rang out from the storm, echoing on the battlefield. When the last ash nail shattered into rust in the air, there was no longer any corrosive species within 100 miles of the city. Only the ashes of embers were left slowly flying in the air. The fox clapped excitedly. Encore, 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 do it again. Do it, my ass. The dispirited Hyride spat out a mouthful of green spittle. The snake had shrunk by a large circle. I can't hold on any longer. It doesn't matter anymore. An impassioned voice rang out from the public channel, accompanied by loud laughter. "If you want to ask why, it's because I'm here." Thousands of lightning bolts shot out from the depths of the gray tide, crisscrossing and instantly tearing a huge crack in the pitch-black ocean. The earth roared. The mountain-like behemoth galloped on the battlefield, constantly trampling the gray tide under its feet, but there was still half a rib in its mouth. It was like a female high school student who went out in a hurry in the morning. But this time, the female high school student's figure and image were a little too scary. Huaishur charged out of the rain of blood with a flurry of swords, axes, and hammers. Her speed increased once again, accompanied by an impassioned hymn. Sharp electric currents appeared on the rainbow halo, making the hymn sound even more punk than it already was. With the help of lightning, Huaishur ran forward, swinging the axe and hammer in his hand with all his strength, and threw them at the big snake in the sky. With a loud sound, the axe and hammer drew an arc in the air, and the burning steel disappeared at the end of the darkness. Crooked. His aim was as crooked as the Nicaragua Trench. In the awkward silence, Huaishur coughed. "Sorry, I didn't hit." "Then why the hell are you shouting?" In an instant, all the behemoths rolled their eyes. Then, they saw Huaishur bending over in the turbulent gray tide. The fanatical electric light enveloped his body, and he was wearing a thunderous robe. He put on a charging posture, raised his head, and showed a reassuring, honest smile on his dog's head. "I'm the Flash." The fox was stunned for a moment, as if it had thought of something. It suddenly panicked, but it was too late to stop it. The next moment, the knockoff Flash moved his forelegs, and under the acceleration of the quadruple U steps, the wild dog, who was off the leash, set off a hurricane in the midst of the earth-shaking, earth-shattering noise, and rushed toward the metal city. "It's over." The fox raised its hand and patted its face, its heart cold. It was finally going to tear down the house. Chapter 371. Imagine that one day, a husky appears next to your model. Every day, it would look at your work with a dangerous gaze, as if it had not had enough activity for the day. When you were not paying attention, it would drool at your model. It was eager to try. From then on, day after day, you hovered on the edge of mental and physical exhaustion. But you could not beat it. Until one day you see it grinning wickedly, opening its mouth and running happily towards your model. The first thing you feel is not fear or panic, but a sense of relief that says, "Ah, this day has finally come." It was like a death row prisoner seeing the executioner who had been suffering from diarrhea finally return to the execution ground. It was a relief. Hurry up and give me a quick death. Now it was time for a quick death. Accompanied by a roar that shook the earth and mountains, the 1,000-mile infernal inferno also stirred up waves in this violent tremor. Huaishur had already rushed over, with electric light, its tongue hanging out, and its huge eyes staring at the big snake in the sky. It was so focused that it did not notice the trembling steel city directly in front of it. The huge shadow of a mountain had already shrouded the trembling Titan Empire. On the city wall, Fox only had time to scream in horror one last time, "Huaishur, no!" The next moment, the roar had already erupted from the front. It was the explosion of thunder tearing through the air. The thin air was ravaged and suddenly squeezed inwards, colliding together, and then retreating to the sides with a whine, repeatedly shaking. Just like the gel used for gun testing under the high-speed camera. On the ground, there were already 4 uniform and deep depressions. The huge force gathered into a beam and went straight to the ground several kilometers below, and then it exploded with a bang. In the end, it succeeded in triggering a chaotic earthquake, adding a new scar to the geological environment that was already riddled with holes under the city. Because the super giant Flash had already exerted force on its 4 limbs and soared into the air, towards the sky, flying straight out. Only its excited voice echoed in the whining wind. "I can fly." It was like a miracle. The out-and-out mountain-level monster had broken free from the shackles of the earth and so willfully soared in the wind, grinning and swinging its tongue as it flew higher. Higher up, the immortal bird tangled in the battle was so scared that its eyes were wide open. It could not care less about defense and flapped its wings desperately to increase its altitude. Immersed in the battle, the big snake was completely unaware of the danger behind it. It was still fully focused on attacking the immortal bird, until it finally heard an excited roar from the turbulent void behind it. It turned back in shock. It saw a black shadow in the 8 huge eyes, growing bigger and bigger until finally, a huge dog's mouth filled its vision. Meow meow? It was as if hundreds of thousands of question marks had risen from the abyss at the same time, filling the earth. In the next moment, Bichimos, who could no longer maintain its upward momentum, grabbed the tip of the tail of the giant serpent. Bichimos exerted all its strength and clenched it tightly. Together with its enormous mass, it fell downwards. In its haste, it only had time to let out a shrill cry that sounded like the cries of countless people. And then, together with Huaishur, flash and flash, flash and flash, flash all members. Fox, who was lucky enough to escape the disaster, raised its head. When it saw the shadow falling rapidly from the sky, its face turned green and it screamed at the top of its lungs. Prepare for earthquake resistance. Before its voice died away, the earth in the distance was like a cesspool that welcomed firecrackers, a diving pool that was poisoned by fatties, or an online game server after the release of a new version. It exploded. Countless Geiger counters were beeping. All observation methods showed that at the center of the explosion, at the moment of the explosion, there was a phenomenon equivalent to nuclear fission with a yield of thousands of tons. A nuclear bomb. Fox's face now looked like a giant character in an American comic from hundreds of years ago, completely green. Before it could say anything, a terrifying shock swept over along with a hurricane. The entire earth instantly turned into a cruel and tyrannical ocean, setting off layers of ripples. The rock stratum was shaking like a carpet, tossing the metal creation that was the size of a coin above it. Everyone felt as if they had been lifted into the air at a certain moment. Then, they fell heavily to the ground amidst the wailing of countless hydraulic valves. The giant stork screeched and widened its eyes to maintain the soft earthquake-resistant layer that could support the entire city. Blood oozed out of its 7 orifices. The enormous pressure felt as if the entire city was crashing down on its body. When Fox finally crawled out from behind the city wall with his face covered in dust, he stuck his head out to look outside the city and finally couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. *T 100 kilometers away from the south of the city, where Huaishur had landed, there were already 3 rocky mountains rising from the empty ground. And in the rising smoke and lava, the terrain had been permanently changed. The crumpled blanket was no longer the proof of the past. Right at the center of the explosion, the huge gray tide had disappeared without a trace. In the mess of death and injury, there were several deep pits formed by intersecting rifts. In the deepest part of the pit, the giant snake that had been split in the middle of its spine could no longer make its original cry. At this moment, its body had been cut into countless pieces, and it weakly let out a series of whimpers. To be able to take this move of mine, one chi of mountains and rivers, you're not bad. Huaishur, who had a concussion, crawled out from the pit and shook his head. He lifted it up as if nothing had happened and punched it in the stomach again. Another part of it was broken. The giant snake was in pain, and its whimpers came to an abrupt end. It let out a shrill cry again, so shrill. A thick poisonous cloud gushed out from the wound and enveloped the deep pit. The terrifying corrosiveness even made Huaishur feel a stinging pain. His eyes, ears, mouth, and nose were burning. What was even more terrifying was that he felt a wave of weakness and exhaustion. He was poisoned. There was actually poison that could still work on him. Despicable, you actually poisoned me. Huaishur panted violently, and inhaled even more poisonous gas. He felt that the symptoms of being poisoned were getting worse and worse. He really had no choice but to fight poison with poison. He lifted the giant snake, opened his mouth wide, and fiercely bit down. There was a crunch. The giant snake spasmed violently, and in the end, it let out a scream and no longer made any sound. It was thoroughly dead. Then, Huaishi's metal breath swept across and dispersed the poisonous cloud. Even though he couldn't breathe much air, he still felt a wave of freshness. He looked down at the snake corpse that was gradually losing its temperature in his hand, and suddenly felt a sense of urgency. I have to write quickly, or it won't taste good when it's cold. The original soup turned into the original food. I have to make use of it while it's hot. He completely forgot that this corpse contained an unknown amount of abyss sediment and fierce poison. Just like a blue bottle, he slurped it up madly. He finally felt full. He skillfully spat out the bones in his mouth and burped. Only then did he realize that his body seemed to have grown bigger. Thinking that he was still 17 years old, and was still growing, it was normal for him to develop occasionally. He didn't take this matter to heart at all. Then, he heard a loud noise behind him, within the metal city. Shrill screams suddenly rang out from dozens of shelters. Huge holes suddenly appeared in the void, and endless abyssal precipitates swept out, forming a tide. Then, a strange corrosive species that looked like a worm slowly poked its head out from inside. It pounced on the crowd with its big mouth full of sharp teeth. It was like a meat grinder had been opened, instantly spurting out countless amounts of blood. No one had expected such a terrifying change in such a hurry. The worm that was rapidly shuttling through space constantly opened up cracks one after another, and the gray tide continuously poured into the city. Its strangely long body crazily shuttled through the city like a parasite. Its body stirred wildly, causing the huge reactor in the center of the city to explode. Then, there was another loud noise. It was the sound of the depth equalizer exploding. In an instant, everyone's expression became extremely ugly. The tourists didn't even have time to greet them, and quickly soared into the sky, rushing into the smoke-filled city. But it was too late. The gravity from hell had already burst out from the center of the city, and the depth dropped crazily. Countless sediment flew up and enveloped all the surviving races. Horrifying distortion and erosion were about to descend. And then, all the explorers who still had the time to pay attention to the situation in the city couldn't help but be stunned. Indeed, the erosion and distortion from hell spread in the city, but it didn't instantly cover everything like the expected explosion, but instead, it seemed to be blocked by some invisible force. Even if there was infiltration, it was still sealed in a certain area, and the focus of the disease couldn't be transferred. It was as if an invisible hand was pushing countless frightened souls, connecting them together in the same place, and the instinct and will to survive burst out, condensing into a substance. It was simply a miracle. Under the cover of the thin and almost imperceptible fog, the majority of the abyss erosion was isolated outside. Even if this layer of protection was so thin and insignificant, it was still an existence that made the difference between something and nothing. Miraculously, under the abyss tide, the erosion was stopped from spreading. A full 6 seconds. A miraculous 6 seconds. And when the hydra that caught its breath suddenly drilled out from the core, its 9 big mouths had already opened crazily, roaring, "Desolate Emperor!" The huge jellyfish returned from the battlefield, countless tentacles curling, fiddling with the air, forming a violent rain, instantly enveloping the entire city. Like the 7 seas bursting the dike, the torrent dissolved all the abyss sediment, turning it into a black tide. And under the hydra's violent swallowing, all of it was absorbed into the hydra's big mouth. Not a single drop was left. After swallowing the countless amounts of abyss sediment, the hydra struggled to curl its swollen body, entangling itself with the strange worm, its 9 mouths tearing at its flesh. Above its metal teeth, A miracle from alchemy wedged into the worm's body, bringing about an instant of rigidity. Like a tug of war, the Hydra struggled to pull it out, flung it up, and flew into the air. There was no need to say anything. The thunderstorm formed by the Taurus constellation instantly swallowed it, and as more than half of the thunderclouds dissipated, the worm had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a burnt smell and flying ashes falling from the sky. At this moment, the Taurus constellation had already shrunk a few times, as thin as an electric arc, unable to maintain its existence. Without saying anything, it threw itself into the remaining reactor. On the verge of death, after the worms were annihilated, the cracks in the void closed up and disappeared. Although there was still chaos in the city, the source had been contained, and restoring stability was only a matter of time. Finally, it took a step back from the cliff of destruction. But the Hydra was stunned on the spot. It stiffly lowered its head and saw its body that was slowly changing color, as if it was rotting, quickly turning black, and constantly growing strange tentacles and limbs. It was being eroded. "Is there still time?" the fox asked. The Hydra shook its head with difficulty, forcing a smile. "No, I'm afraid, sorry. You have completed your mission, no need to say anything more." The fox lowered its eyes. "Goodbye." "Okay." While it still had its reason, the Hydra struggled to swim out of the city, and came in front of Huaishur. It raised its head, which had grown tentacles and sarcomas, and grinned. "Sorry to trouble you. Isn't this part of my job?" Huaishur was silent for a moment, and the axe of wrath quickly appeared in his hand. Seeing the blade and axe slowly raised, even though the Hydra was already prepared, it still could not help but panic. "Hey, be careful, don't worry." Huaishur comforted it. "I often do this, it's very nimble." Gulyala was amused. "Nonsense, who would chop off the head of their teammates all day long?" Before he finished his words, the blade of the axe burst out, and dozens of crisscrossing cold lights burst out in the air, flashing and disappearing. The giant snake stiffened on the spot, its lips slightly opened, as if it was silently admiring. "Well done." It slowly closed its eyes and turned into ashes without a care in the world. This was the first explorer to leave after the arrival of the apocalypse. Chapter 372. The second diamond leopard to die. Although he often bickered with Bluebird, their relationship was actually quite good. Ever since they came here, they had been traveling together. In order to save Bluebird, that guy risked his life to fight against 5 of them. After bringing Bluebird back, he was already on the verge of death and couldn't hold on for long. In the end, Huaishur came back again. This was part of his mission. Among all of them, his abyssal resistance was the highest. According to his calculations, even if everyone was turned into corrosive species, he could still live well. Besides, his skills were good. He was the only one who could do this kind of work. The third person to die was a guy who usually didn't talk much. That huge bat had pounced on the central engine unit and forcibly blocked the second wave of attack. When he was rescued, his whole body was almost burnt to a crisp. After that, Huaishur could finally say goodbye to this uncomfortable mission. Although the war was not over, the situation was already under control. 9 hours later, the border satellite has finally detected the edge of the gray tide. Fox, whose body was covered in sticky blood, said in the channel, "Everyone, get ready. Say goodbye to this damned war." Even if the gray tide outside had broken through the city's defense line several times, and the Ultralisks were all injured, the situation was unprecedentedly dangerous, but Fox's tone was still calm. The news was quite exciting. When the endless gray tide finally caught a glimpse of the edge, the exhaustion of fighting until the end of the world disappeared. Even if the situation was bad, at least the enemy could be killed, as long as they worked harder. In fact, they did not need to continue to work hard. When the central control room determined that most of the gray tide had entered the effective killing range, and this war had attracted all the enemies, the war could be declared over. Now it was just a countdown. Purely in terms of destructive power, the evolved species that had entered the late stage were not inferior to any ultralisk. Under the irrigation of thousands of years of knowledge in the present realm, they had far surpassed them. As early as 100 years ago, the nuclear weapons stockpiled by mankind were enough to overturn the entire present realm. 100 years had passed, and although the times had changed as if the world had changed, the sad thing was that mankind still hadn't changed. As several flight formations rose from the runway, broke through the obstruction of the erosion-breeding birds, and flew into the distance, everyone could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. What happened next was nothing worth mentioning. It was nothing more than continuing to defend and waiting. They were waiting for the 17 heavy mass generators that could cover millions of miles of the gray tide to be in place. With the countdown in the central control room, 3 hours passed in a flash. Fox threw himself into a chair and took a deep puff of his homemade tobacco pipe. He couldn't hide his exhaustion. "Do you know what I'm most grateful for right now?" He looked around and looked at his colleagues in the last half a minute of the countdown. "Fortunately, this F*King world is leaking." A burst of laughter rang out. Everyone stared intently at the countdown, as if they were celebrating the new year, full of anticipation, as they chanted in unison. 10, 9, 8. In the roar, the metal city shook again. The buffer layer was instantly blasted and demolished, replaced by thousands of bolt-like steel columns that violently connected the entire city and the steel composite structure in the underground fortifications that had been completed long ago. It was as if a nail had been hammered into the stable stratum. 7, 6, 5. Everyone. In the sky, the undying bird suddenly flapped its wings and once again unleashed a terrifying flame that swept across hundreds of miles, instantly clearing all the gray tide around the city. Then, it swooped down and roared in the public channel. "Prepare for impact." Needless to say, long before the countdown began, all the giant beasts ran up to Huaishir's back one by one, allowing the layers of sorrowful rope to tie themselves up like dumplings. Tears streamed down their faces, but they did not come down. They did not even struggle. Instead, they kept on ordering, "Tie it up 2 more times, bro, a little more. You're already crying like this and you still want more? So what if I'm emotional?" Okay. Huaishir readily followed its advice. Fearing that it would not be satisfied, he even rubbed a ball and stuffed it into its mouth. Looking at its excited face, it should be very happy. Then, Huaishir lay down in the hole that it had just made. It even tried to burrow down a little, its 2 front claws digging into the ground like an excavator. In an instant, it had dug out a hole big enough to bury half of itself. After burrowing into it, it lay down and would not move even if it was beaten to death. As for the gray tide that was excitedly pouncing on the metal city, it could not be bothered. And the countdown had finally reached its end. 3, 2, 1. As the earth suddenly shook, the world fell silent. It was as if someone had opened a bottle of champagne in a faraway place and simply pulled out the cork, making a popping sound. Then, a shuddering sense of danger rose in the consciousness of every giant beast. They burrowed into the soil, but they heard the wailing of the earth. The earth's crust was shaking, roaring, and falling apart. Terrifying heat spewed out from the earth's mantle with unprecedented geological movements. In an instant, the whole world was illuminated by the remaining lava, and it was blood-red. The blood-red flames were flowing into the distance. It was as if it was being pulled by invisible little hands. At first, it was a breeze that was difficult to detect. Then, it became a howling wind that rushed into the distance. The last remaining thin air was ruthlessly swept away, along with the countless screaming gray tide on the earth. The world was violently shaking. Everything between heaven and earth was thrown into a small box, and then put into the drum of a washing machine, spinning and shaking wildly. Everything was in turmoil. Even though there were layers of mountains between them, the giant beast next to Huaishur screamed in horror, "Stand still, don't go over there, you're squeezing me to death, it's not me." Huaishur buried his head in the soil in horror, "Something is sucking me over there." Everything in the world was drifting in all directions. The earth suddenly tightened in an instant, like a blanket that had been pulled, and then it fell apart amidst the wailing of countless earth and rocks. If one looked down from the sky, one would be able to see the tragic scene of the boundless earth cracking inch by inch and being covered by lava. If this place was set as a planet, then the planet would have exploded at this moment, under the encirclement of the 17 small black dots. With the activation of the heavy mass generator, the 17 gravitational poles were instantly formed under the irrigation of a huge amount of energy. Even in physics, a law that was a taboo was activated here. Rather than calling it a law, it was better to call it a vicious bug. In Zarathustra's great mystery, countless laws were difficult to cover and resolve. They could only be forcibly blocked and refused to activate branch possibilities. Just like how skyscrapers would have some small flaws, in some cases, when the complex laws in physics collided, it would produce some situations that even the Creator had not imagined. And in these many situations, if the preconditions were met, then it would lead to the birth of an infinitely small singularity with infinite mass and infinite gravitational force that could even distort space and time. In other words, it was a black hole. Now, 17 celestial bodies that only existed in popular literature were instantly born on this land, showing their tyrannical majesty. In just a few seconds, 1/10 of the world was violently hollowed out. From the center, if one looked down, one could see through the thick bottom layer to the abyss of the void at the bottom. At this moment, this world with a square sky and a square earth was being ravaged, together with all the erosive seeds. The moment the heavy mass generator was activated, more than 2/3 of the erosive seeds were sucked into it, crushed into pieces, and disappeared. The remaining erosive seeds were screaming and fleeing. Finally, under the terrifying gravitational pull, they were pulled into the eternal darkness. 3 seconds. When the 3 seconds that were comparable to the destruction of the world itself had passed, the entire world had become a ruin. The apocalyptic world had completely ushered in the true end of the world under its ravaging. Fortunately, the dead world would not be able to kill it again. Smashing a broken jar was just recycling waste. Even so, the entire metal city, together with the heavy underground fortifications below, was pulled out of the ground by dozens of meters. If it were not for the fact that its mass was too huge, it would have been pulled into the sky by now. If it was unlucky enough to fall into the gravitational field, it would be instantly torn to pieces. There was no way to guard against it. There was no way to defend. This was the most terrifying place in Zarathustra. Even if there were countless terrifying existences in the endless depths of hell, as long as the 3 great mystic instruments were still around, those unimaginable horrors would never be willing to enter the present realm. The value of the Creator was in construction and protection, but more often than not, once the power they brought was used for killing, no ascendant could compare to it. Even the general, who was once the most promising person to approach heaven and earth, punched with all his strength, was comparable to a nuclear explosion. But was nuclear explosions really that rare in the modern realm? It was possible to find a garage, steal some uranium ore, and finally get an ordinary professor who was not afraid of death to achieve it. Although the effect was incomparable, it was not easy. But how could this kind of thing that could be mass-produced and increased in production not be better than a lunatic who did not listen to orders? No matter how powerful the angel fighter was, the resources spent in order to cultivate an angel fighter were enough to buy a fighter fleet. After all, behind every high-level ascendant was one or even several full vaults that had been burned. It was really not cost-effective. It was a pity that this was probably the last time the Eternal Titan Empire would see such a scene. After all, this was not the present realm. After leaving the city, all laws would be invalid. And the alchemy that could maintain the heavy mass generator was only done by Hydra. It was not a city that needed to be rebuilt, nor was it hundreds of thousands of victims and other dead beasts, nor was it a worse environment. This was the most disastrous loss they had suffered this time. Chapter 373. Fortunately, today's Eternal Titan Empire was the only living thing left in this world. Even the enemy no longer existed. This might be the mercy of the Creator. The leaders of the large group formed by the mutants were the easiest to deal with. They were nothing more than a slightly stronger wild beast. The Creator did not arrange any destructive subordinates or personal troops to come over, which was already equivalent to an easy level of difficulty. If they encountered a Creator with a worse personality, it was not impossible for a bug like the surviving evil to appear. Now, the surviving mutants had fled in all directions. It would not be long before they welcomed death in the desolation and vacuum, right? The great enemy was gone. When Huai inadvertently looked back, he saw that the faint fog shrouding the city was also disappearing rapidly. In a trance, he seemed to see a vague outline, but he could not see it clearly. In an instant, it disappeared with the fog. Only a pair of eyes looked at him and waved at him faintly. The fog dissipated together with the illusion. Huai was stunned for a long time. He did not know why he felt that the gaze was particularly familiar. "Don't be stunned." The undying bird passed by him. "Everyone, let's have a meeting. How's the rescue situation? We're rushing to do emergency repairs and first aid." "What about the damage assessment?" "It's still in the drafting stage, but a conservative estimate is that at least 1/3 of the factories and equipment need large-scale maintenance and reprocessing." "Sounds good. At least it's still within the acceptable range." The undying bird nodded. "So what's the next situation?" "It's terrible." Fox sighed. "To be exact, it's terrible. Hydra shouldn't be so impulsive. If he were to be snobbish, he would rather use 3 times the loss to exchange for Hydra's loss. But at that time, it would be completely overturned. If Hydra stood by and did nothing, it was still unknown whether everyone would still be able to sit here and chat. Even if the consequences were tragic, it was still a pain that had to be endured. If they wanted to survive, sometimes they had to make some sacrifices, even if it was to drink poison to quench their thirst. As long as they could linger on at death's door for a second, they would not care about anything else. Isn't there still the alchemists? Although it's sad to say this, but the two sides are on completely different levels. After pondering for a moment, Fox said straightforwardly, "The difference in size between the two sides is like the difference between the strongest kobold in the city and the Huai. With their abilities, just taking over all the alchemy matrices left behind by Hydra is already difficult enough. Asking them to take a step further in the development and production of the alchemy matrices is just a dream." The Phoenix was silent for a long time. It looked disappointed, but it could not help but sigh in relief. Fortunately, at the very least, the depth control instrument and sediment discharge matrix in the city could still continue to operate. Otherwise, without the Hydra, the entire city would have turned into the abyss sooner or later. At that time, the Eternal Titan Empire would probably have the word Hell added to it. "Is there any worse news?" "Bad news?" Fox slammed a thick stack of reports on the table. "I have a bunch here. Which one do you want to hear?" The Phoenix shrugged. "Let's talk about the worst one first. We're all still alive." "What's the second worst?" "We will all die." Fox looked around at everyone and calmly said, "It's just that some people will die in front of everyone." No one said anything. In the silence, they all felt an indescribable heaviness at the same time. The joy of victory had disappeared without a trace. This was not a decisive battle, but an arduous journey with no end in sight. There was no such thing as automatically entering a happy ending after defeating the boss. They could only move forward together. They tied each other with safety ropes and climbed an endless snowy mountain, relying on their own thin body temperature to fight against the harsh world. But no matter how much they supported each other, someone would fall first. Every time one of them fell, their efficiency of moving forward would slow down a little. Until the first snowflake that fell caused an irreversible collapse, the situation completely collapsed. Death was like an avalanche, covering everyone. Before the arrival of death, they did not have the luxury of breathing. "Cheer up!" The Phoenix's low voice dispelled the depressed and uneasy atmosphere. Its majestic eyes scanned the surroundings. "If you want to admit defeat, leave immediately and go home to lie on the sofa. If you're a man, no, if you really have a little sense of responsibility for this world, then put away that childish face of yours when you hear that winter and summer vacations are cancelled." Everyone looked shocked and subconsciously held their heads high. The Phoenix looked around at them and nodded with satisfaction. "That's more like it. I'm not asking you to work hard to pay the mortgage during the day, sign the divorce agreement with your wife at night, go home and help your children with their homework. At best, you'll just die. What's there to be afraid of?" There was a burst of laughter among the giant beasts. It seemed that only this kind of cold and heartless adult joke could warm people's hearts at this time. If you looked at it this way, the apocalypse was gentler than the present. At least they didn't have to worry about the monthly loan when they opened their eyes every day. "Are you all awake?" The Phoenix withdrew its gaze. "If you're all awake, get to work. There's no time for you to dawdle. Do you hear me? Go to work." Under its impatient command, the giant beasts dispersed in a hubbub. In the silence, Fox stood in place and looked at it with its head tilted. "Why don't you let me continue? If I continue, everyone doesn't have to work. Just leave and go home." Without long-term considerations, there must be immediate worries. Fox sighed. "I just want everyone to understand the seriousness of the situation. Thinking about success or failure and how to succeed or fail is between the two of us." The Phoenix replied calmly, "Leading people to march is not leading people to do research. It's a bit cruel to say this, but the soldiers who rush to the battlefield don't need to worry about things like supplies and whether there will be friendly artillery support after a month. They just need to rush forward and be done with it." Fox was silent for a long time and sighed softly. "It's not necessarily a bad thing to die with hope. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but no one here is afraid of death." The Phoenix told him, "They're not afraid, I'm not afraid, so you shouldn't be afraid." Fox smiled bitterly. "But if possible, who doesn't want to live well?" "Yes," the Phoenix whispered, "because of this, sacrifice will be meaningful, won't it?" It stopped talking and rose into the air, and flew into the distance. After the end of that battle, the intensive production still continued. Although there was no air in the outside world, the Titan Empire still found a way to synthesize oxygen after putting up the isolation shield. After the discussion and hosting of many scholars, the race began to evolve again. After neglecting the improvement of physical fitness, the focus was on the enhancement of resistance and tolerance. After reducing the consumption of intake, the resistance to a large number of negative states was enhanced. Once they stepped into the standard, the technological ability of the entire Titan Empire began to improve rapidly. Without the obstacles of the laws and regulations of the present world, no matter how inhumane the experiments and modifications were, they went smoothly as if success was achieved when the conditions were right, and the results were remarkable. Whether it was the extraction of the genes from the giant beasts for modification or the acceleration of their own mechanization, after 3 transformations and collectivization surgery, it was difficult to distinguish the original race of the residents just by looking at their appearance. Not only the appearance, but the organs and survival methods in the body were gradually converging. It was as if the integration process was unbelievably smooth. And just as the last evolution was completed, everyone observed a thin fog shrouding the sky above the city. Compared to the last time Huai Shi saw it, It was undoubtedly much thicker, as if it was gradually growing stronger. There were faint fluctuations of origin substance, but it was difficult to see the traces of origin substance flowing and interfering with matter. The moment the fog formed, the scholars fell into a state of shock. Huai-Shi also felt a rhythm coming from within his body. It was the sleeping souls of hundreds of thousands of lizardmen, responding to the call of the fog. Huai-Shi hesitated for a moment, but no longer restrained them. Soon, wisps of white gas rose from under his scales and merged with the fog along with the gentle hymns, causing the fog to become even thicker. It was not clear whether to say that he was relieved of a burden or disappointed. The departure of hundreds of thousands of lizardmen's souls made Huai-Shi's consciousness much more relaxed and nimble, and he no longer had the clumsy feeling of carrying a heavy load. However, after getting used to carrying a heavy load in the past, Huai-Shi actually felt a little uncomfortable. It was a little too light. The lizardmen did not take away Huai-Shi's beloved RGB halo. Instead, they generously gifted him with all of their remaining origin substance and faith. They didn't even take away their own memories, they simply merged their most fundamental consciousness into the fog. Immediately after, the fog seemed to have eaten a great tonic as it rapidly condensed. In the end, it actually formed an illusionary spring water that flashed and disappeared. That feeling was exceptionally familiar, and Huai-Shi was stunned for a long time. He couldn't believe it. The Silver Sea? That was indeed the impression that the Silver Sea had left on Huai-Shi. It was the place where all of the present realm's knowledge and mysteries flowed out, the sea of miracles that contained all of the miracles and souls. However, compared to the spectacular scene that Huai-Shi had once witnessed, this spring was somewhat shabby and insignificant. However, the essence of the two was undoubtedly the same. It wasn't just Huai-Shi who could tell. Everyone could tell. Very quickly, the eyes of dozens of ordinary members in the city lit up with the light of origin substance, and they instantly underwent a transformation. A sublimator had appeared? The scholars all sucked in a breath of cold air. Although there were many differences between sublimators and sublimators, and even their souls were the same as blank slates, there was no doubt that this was a soul structure unique to sublimators. They had been bestowed with souls. The huge surprise made everyone feel excited. Although this power was still too small compared to the current giant beasts, no matter what, it was still a rare and valuable improvement. It was just like how Gagarin, the astronaut of the Russian Federation, had taken his first step on the moon. It was of great significance. Putting aside the existence of the sublimators, the moment the Silver Sea appeared, the various laws that had been set up inside the city quickly stabilized. It was as if they had been wedged into this space, and they no longer needed to be maintained as tediously as before. It was as if a large factory had replaced the original small workshop of the scholars. It could almost be regarded as a small Zarathustra's secret apparatus. This was crucial to the stability of the Eternal Titan Empire. With such an unexpected good thing happening, everyone's confidence in getting through the end of the world was boosted. This might be the last ray of light before the long winter night arrived. From that day onwards, the temperature began to drop day by day. Chapter 374. More than a month later. When Huai-Shi opened his eyes, he felt a burst of discomfort in his nostrils. He took 2 deep breaths before he felt the remains in his nasal cavity fly out and hit the ground like cannonballs. The ice cubes mixed with a large amount of iron chips shattered on the ground. Immediately after, a burning pain emerged from his nostrils. His nasal mucosa, which was relatively fragile compared to his armor, was frostbitten. He spat out 2 mouthfuls of fire with great effort, and his stiff body finally warmed up a little. When he moved, the frozen scales made a sharp sound, and a large amount of thin frost fell to the ground, making the crisp sound of metal colliding. Huai-Shi twisted his neck and felt the bones in his body creaking. He could not help but sigh. When will these days come to an end? 190. 75 degrees Celsius at Huaishi's feet. The frozen giant thermometer still maintained the last display before his death. Huaishi shook his head. It was 10 degrees lower. As he moved his body and ate a large amount of iron ore again, the temperature in his body gradually rose, melting the thin layer of frost under his feet. The body temperature, which was like an oven, turned a large amount of frozen water into hot air and spread out, causing the kobolds in heavy protective clothing around him to moan in comfort. Huaishi yawned, still feeling a little sleepy. As the temperature gradually dropped, even someone as energetic as him gradually felt sleepy a few days ago. When he could not take it anymore, he took a nap. How long did I sleep? 6 hours. The person in charge of the smelting center said, "It's time to start work. According to the production plan, we still have a gap of about 14,000 tons. Thank you for your hard work." "It's no big deal." Huaishi smacked his lips and looked up. "Prop up the biggest furnace. We might as well finish it in one go." "Will it work?" "At most, I'll sleep for a while after I'm done." Huaishi waved his hand nonchalantly. There was no wind in the vacuum. Nowadays, everyone could only communicate through radio when they were outdoors. Giant beasts could communicate with origin substances, but they had to be careful when talking to normal people, especially someone like Huaishi. His origin substance had already crystallized into tens of thousands of tons in his bone marrow. If he raised his voice just a little, it would be easy for him to turn a normal person into a vegetable. Deified creatures were scary to ordinary people. Even a sublimator would get a headache if they talked to Huaishi for too long. It didn't matter how hard Huaishi tried to suppress his will. Under Huaishi's orders, the engineering team started to restart the production line and the factory to complete the warm-up. Ever since the weather became colder and colder, the huge metal smelting furnace that had just been built a few days ago was abandoned because it wasted too much heat and was not cost-effective enough. Only an existence like Huaishi would be able to save a little more effort and time and get it done in one go. Before the ceiling opened, Huaishi warmed up his body. He took a deep breath and spat out a few wisps of flame. When he felt the temperature rise, he took a deep breath. Scary flames spewed out. In an instant, the furnace in front of him was burning red. Only the beginning stages of smelting ores could use such a crude method. As long as the temperature rose, it would be easy to do anything. But the weather was too bad. This time, Huaishi had to spit until his mouth was dry before he was able to boil the molten steel. He was so young, but he didn't have enough firepower. Huaishi fell into a deep depression. He started to think about whether he had been too reckless and his body was starting to feel weak. That couldn't be right. Aside from some slight signs of rheumatism, there was nothing wrong with him. This damned weather was too annoying. Since 2 months ago, the temperature had been dropping day by day. Now, it was almost 200 degrees below zero, and it didn't seem to be stopping. According to the scholars' estimates, the temperature would not stop until it dropped to 270 degrees below zero. By then, it would be close to absolute zero. With the current technology, it could only reach this level. No, it should be said that thermodynamics had drawn this boundary from the beginning to maintain the greatest degree of stability. Even the heat death of the apocalypse would not be exaggerated to go below 270 degrees. The area below that was meaningless even to hell. At the very least, in the current abyss exploration, except for the talents of some creatures and the authority of the lord of a large group, there was no environment in hell that could reach below absolute zero. For Huaishi, there was no need for the temperature to reach 270 degrees. He had already begun to miss his woolen trousers. By the way, what do you think about my woolen trousers? The person in charge of the smelting center was silent for a long time. His tone was complicated. Fox thought you were joking. I didn't mention it again. But his expression at that time was very interesting. It was the kind of expression that said, "You must be joking, right? Please tell me you must be joking." His expression. To be honest, I don't think it's very realistic. Why is it not realistic? Huaishi's eyes widened. I have contributed so much to the Empire. Why won't the Empire give me a pair of woolen trousers? You have to be able to afford it, brother. The person in charge glanced at him helplessly. Forget about the woolen trousers. Knitting a pair of underwear for you will use up all our current thermal insulation materials. Huaishi was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said seriously, You reminded me. I don't wear underwear. So, can you find a way to make one for me? If it's not possible to make a pair of boxers, bullet pants will do. Can't we at least negotiate now? After the person in charge cleaned up the blood he spat through the mask, he took 2 deep breaths and waved his hand righteously. I don't think it's possible. You don't have to think it. No one can think it's possible. Tisk, capitalists really don't shed any blood or tears. Huaishi glanced at him in disdain. He raised his hand and scratched his teeth. Then, he used his ability to pull out 2 iron pillars that were hundreds of meters long. When he held them in his 2 hands, they felt like 2 slender iron skewers. Wait a minute, what are you doing? Knitting trousers. Huaishi put his 2 hands together and kept twisting a thick steel cable. He rolled it together like a ball of yarn and tied it into a huge ball. The 2 iron skewers collided and burst out a burst of dazzling sparks in the vacuum. Huaishi moved his fingers a little to find the feeling. He raised his head and asked, Do you want to learn? I will teach you. You don't look like you have a girlfriend. You can knit a sweater for yourself later. No, thank you. For some reason, the person in charge seemed to be very angry. Was it because he couldn't learn how to knit? That was strange. Huaishi shook his head and clicked his tongue twice. He didn't pay any more attention to him. He didn't think about whether the steel cable wool trousers could keep him warm or how embarrassing it was to wear a pair of dog sleigh wool trousers. The days of trying to find joy in the midst of bitterness came to an end when the temperature officially fell below 200 degrees. Huang Qianqian can't hold on any longer. At the emergency meeting, Fox brought another piece of bad news. As their only source of drinking water, Huang Qianqian had been under considerable pressure. After all, it was okay to have no electricity and no food, but having no water was no joke. Moreover, compared to personal use, the shortage of industrial water was the biggest problem. Huaishi's large-scale smelting center was even more water-consuming. A large amount of toxic wastewater was produced during the refining and synthesis of some rare alloys. It couldn't even be used twice. Now that Huang Qianqian was gone, it was undoubtedly bad news. Wasn't it fine 2 days ago? At this temperature, I can't wait to peel off my skin and make a cotton-padded jacket when I go out, let alone a jellyfish. Fox said expressionlessly, It's not easy to hold on until now. If you have time later, say goodbye to her. By the time Huaishi saw Huang Qianqian again, he almost couldn't recognize her. In his original impression, the beautiful jellyfish that was large enough to cover the entire city was now broken into pieces, twitching in the warm pool with difficulty. He could vaguely see the small organs in it slowly pulsating, full of pain. Even if she didn't really die during the witch's night, the pain she felt before dying definitely wouldn't be any less. In fact, it might even be stronger. After all, the behemoth's large size meant that it had more nerves and more subbrains. One portion of pain could even become 2 portions. After using the medicine, her condition finally improved a bit. An origin substance figure slowly rose from her body, as if it was using her original appearance. It was a middle-aged woman wearing glasses, wearing a suit and looking capable. After seeing Fox and Phoenix, she slowly nodded. I didn't disappoint you, my friends. Before this, she had already exhausted the last of her ability to create a massive iceberg in the extreme cold. It was almost as large as Huaishi. With the current purification cycle, it was enough to support the next generation of industrial purifiers. Otherwise, her condition wouldn't be so bad. However, the phoenix and the fox also agreed to this action. Even though it would be painful for her, before she was on the verge of death, it was better to take advantage of the fact that she still had energy to recover as much as possible. "Thank you for your dedication," Fox asked. "Is there anything else we can do?" "No need. The research that needs to be done has already been completed. I should have left a long time ago." Huang Qianqian shook her head, and the origin substance slowly dissipated. "I wish you good luck." In the warm pool, the jellyfish's body suddenly collapsed inch by inch, melting and dissipating. In the end, what appeared from her body was a dark green spring. An endless stream of water flowed out from it. This was the final gift she had left behind. Even though it wasn't enough to supply industry, it was more than enough clean water for all the evolved races to drink. After a short period of silence, Fox stared at the pool and couldn't help but sigh. "Next, we need to carry out the migration plan." He turned around and said seriously, "According to the map drawn by the previous satellite, we need to find another area with abundant geothermal energy. According to the plan, everyone should start preparing." The sorrowful atmosphere was instantly dispelled, and everyone once again threw themselves into their busy work. About a month later, the metal city, enveloped in a thick layer of insulation, was pulled by thousands of tower cranes and slowly landed on Huaishi's back. It fit perfectly with the base. As Huaishi slowly stood up, the metal city on his back didn't move in the slightest. It didn't even shake in the slightest. "This time, I'm really going to become a sled dog." Huaishi turned around. His 4 hands tightened the steel cable straps on his body. After moving his body a bit, he pulled on the sorrowful rope. With the support of the tracks, the enormous iceberg suddenly shook and slid out with him into the depths of the icy darkness. Without saying a word, they embarked on the path of migration. In the original city, only layers of frost appeared from the entrance of the underground fortifications. There was no sound in the silence. Only the originally lonely satellite still flickered with a dim light, illuminating Huaishi's back. They gradually went further and further away. It seems like a lot of friends can't see this in the author chat. Actually, I'm very diligent in asking for votes every month. It's the last day, so please vote for me. Chapter 375. He walked about 410,000 miles to the south. He passed through the barren plains, walked past the collapsed mountains, and finally stepped onto the dry seabed. The world was dark. There was no other sound except for Huaishi's footsteps and the rumbling of the moving iceberg behind him. In the silence, Huaishi paused and looked around blankly. "What's wrong?" Fox in the observation room asked. "I think I heard a voice." Huaishi scratched the back of his head. Sparks flew. "It seems like someone is calling me." Fox was silent for a long time. "I think it's because there's no one to talk to. Your ears are getting restless." "I really heard it." Okay. I'll call the talk team to come to work, okay? "I really didn't mean that. I'll call 2 more for you, okay?" "Okay." Huaishi nodded. So fragrant. Then, he threw the whispers echoing in his ears to the back of his mind. The tip of his nose hurt a little. It seemed like he had been kicked by something small. Huaishi rubbed his nose, grinned, and continued to gallop with the iceberg in the cold vacuum, disappearing into the distance. Fu Yi gave up trying to communicate. "This guy is a dog, right? He must be a dog. Everyone has turned into a dog. I didn't expect that he was the only one who showed his true form." His spirit was so tenacious that he could continue to laugh foolishly even at the end of the world. Fu Yi didn't know what to say. She could only admire him deeply. She felt that she must have turned into mist. At least, that was the case at the beginning. She swore that she had originally intended to listen to Huaishi's words and was prepared to leave. But before leaving, she suddenly thought of something. There seems to be a piece of divine remains in my space that the old granny gave me. Since I'm leaving, Why don't I just use it? She completely ignored the originally handsome old granny's careful reminder and the warning that the success rate was only 30%. Fu Yi took out the divine remains. Fu Yi clicked on it and Fu Yi succeeded. It was faster than expected. Rather than calling it a skeleton, it would be more accurate to call it a wisp of mist sealed in amber. It opened with a slight twist. Then, it naturally merged with Fu Yi's body, turning her already transparent little body completely invisible. In the end, Fu Yi completely disappeared from the Astronomical Society's observation. To a certain extent, he had indeed left the stage. However, she didn't seem to have retreated to the outside world. Instead, after losing her body, her origin substance seemed to have undergone a miraculous transformation. Even her spirit form characteristics seemed to have disappeared. She exited the game, but the client did not close. Instead, she entered the perspective of a bystander. She no longer needed food, water, or even air. Everyone's consciousness was like a shining bubble. She could easily pass through it and observe the sparks that were constantly bursting out of their souls as they thought. It was even possible to slightly adjust the direction of the sparks. No one would notice that there was a small hand quietly interfering with their thoughts, inadvertently neglecting some important things. Then Huai Shi would tire her to death. This bastard swallowed hundreds of thousands of lizardmen's origin substances in one go, evolving from steel Garuru into Huai Shi's cinerary urn. It was like peeling hundreds of thousands of crayfish in one go, stripping all the lizardmen's pain and despair from the core of Huai Shi's consciousness at once, so that he wouldn't really become a mad dog. Fu Yi had never peeled so many crayfish in her life, and she didn't want to see this kind of damn thing in the future. So, this bastard didn't feel wronged at all for taking on two people's divine punishment at once. There was always a price to pay for being stubborn. Then, Fu Yi, who had overexerted herself, fell asleep, sinking into the hundreds of thousands of lizardmen's dreams, like a fish returning to the ocean. She felt a burst of carefree feeling. It was as if this was her domain, and reality was just another bigger dream outside the dream. What kind of creature was this? Or were some creatures just like this? Sometimes she would think like this, but most of the time she would just wander through one dream after another, bored. Then, she would watch Huai Shi's stupid appearance through the halo of light. What happened next was nothing to write home about. She jumped from one dream to another until she finally arrived at a city that seemed to have been tailor-made for her. She once again fell into a busy state. Instinctively, she used the origin substances to connect one consciousness after another, forming a massive network. Finally, she guided the origin substances to flow through this invisible network. She watched as one strange silhouette after another emerged from this complex network, searching for some kind of principle to operate within it. Prototype, inexplicably, this realization appeared in her consciousness. Unlike Huai Shi, who was an ignorant and incompetent person, Fu Yi was still a good student. She had even read a little about the prototype theory, which was an obscure philosophy that most students didn't understand at all. At the very least, she had some understanding of it. Whether it was called a meme or a prototype, regardless of whether it had self-awareness or not, this was the conclusion that intelligent creatures would subconsciously come to when stimulated by external stimuli. It was just like how primitive murals used red to represent the sun, and death was always pitch black and terrifying. This was a feeling that didn't need to be conveyed through words. It was a kind of human intelligence that reacted to certain aspects of the world. This kind of ability existed in every creature's consciousness. In the end, it flowed through the network and into the fog that Fu Yi was in. It formed a sea of consciousness that only existed in theories and legends. Fu Yi felt like she had turned from a stoat into a sea otter. Not only did her appearance not change, but she also had to work hard to expand the environment that she lived in. She had to work hard to stabilize the sea of fog so that she could feel more comfortable. Thankfully, time was always speeding up. As long as she had this thought, it would naturally take action. This saved her from exhausting her willpower through repetitive work. Not only that, but she also had to work hard to avoid losing too much. After the astral beasts left, she had to intercept a portion of the origin substances that had dissipated and merge it with the sea that she had entered. If the distance was too great, she would be unable to do anything. This extra portion of energy could be used to create a few more ascenders. She had completely turned into an old farmer. She hoped that a few acres of crops would quickly grow. Fu Yi's heart was filled with despair. If she had known earlier, she would have left as soon as possible. This endless overtime was really too much. Could it be that she had accidentally offended that handsome old granny? That couldn't be, right? They chatted quite happily. The days passed in this way, day after day of hard work. Under Fu Yi's efforts, the entire place finally looked a little more like it should. Until one day, in the increasingly cold weather of the outside world, she heard the words of the fox. "We need to leave this place." The fox said, "We need to find the earth tropics." Fu Yi silently watched as the entire city began to move again. She forcefully roused herself and carried the Silver Sea on an unknown journey. Apart from the fox herself, she was the only one who knew. This was a lie. There was no earth tropics at all. Regardless of whether or not this was a planet, or whether or not there was a core or mantle, even lava should have cooled down a long time ago in this kind of bitterly cold weather. This world had already died. Could she still hope that the lava that was her bloodline would continue to remain warm? There was only a long road ahead of them. There was no end. She sighed softly, but did not expose its lie. At least, the Silver Sea, which was cold because of the reflection of reality in the past, now had a glimmer of hope. As long as there was hope, it was always a good thing. But it was still so annoying. Fu Yi sighed and kicked Huaisher hard. As usual, this guy had no reaction at all. Looking at his heartless appearance, Fu Yi was angry. If she had known earlier, she would not have modified his memory. At least let him worry about her, so that he would not be idle all day and die of boredom. She returned to the thin Silver Sea and fell into a deep sleep again. In the current dome of the Metal City, the fox saw the immortal bird. The latter was looking at the endless darkness outside the porthole. When she heard the fox come in, she turned back and asked, "When are you going to tell them the truth?" "What truth?" The fox looked calm, as if he did not understand. "You know what I'm talking about," the immortal bird said. "Are you going to hide it from them like this?" The fox glanced at it and asked, "Didn't I learn this from you? I always feel that you make sense in everything you do." "But these are two completely different things, aren't they?" The immortal bird said seriously. "If lies are said to be good intentions, deceiving people to die and deceiving them to continue living are completely different. The former can be released in the end, but the latter will be tortured. Sometimes, death is much easier than living. You are now deceiving them to pursue an endless hope, but there will be a day when dreams and hopes will be shattered. When they discover that there is no tropical zone in this world, what are you going to use to continue leading them forward?" The fox sighed and took off his hat, revealing the sparse hair on his head. "Is there a better way?" "I do," the immortal bird said firmly, "but you have to listen to my arrangements." "Okay." The fox nodded. 30 minutes later, Bichimo's advance came to an abrupt halt. Huaisher turned back in astonishment. "What the hell?" "A meeting," the immortal bird said. "First of all, a piece of bad news." At the impromptu emergency meeting, the immortal bird said, "It's now -240 degrees Celsius. I'm afraid we won't be able to catch up with the natural retreat of the tropical zone. There's a 70% chance that we will miss." "What?" Huaisher was stunned. "Then I've walked for nothing?" Failed explorations are for more possibilities of success. After a moment of silence, the immortal bird suddenly said, "I have a suggestion that can be implemented. No, it should be an order. As the direct leader of all the explorers now, and the member in the front row of all the members of the Astronomical Society present, I ask you to completely obey my orders. It told everyone straightforwardly, next I will ignite myself. Amidst everyone's shock and astonishment, the immortal bird told everyone present, I will become the new sun. This was its solution. On the first day of the month, please vote. Chapter 376. That's ridiculous. This was Huaishi's first reaction. Brother, what are you thinking? But then, he felt that it was not completely unreasonable, but wasn't this a bit too tragic? Huaishi asked bluntly, what's the difference between this and burning people as firewood? The difference is that at least we have firewood to burn, the undying bird replied calmly. Otherwise, we will freeze to death. I object, Huaishi said directly. It's not that time yet. Is your objection useful, Huaishi? The undying bird glanced at him indifferently. Now that you have been urgently recruited, I am your direct superior. Execute my orders. Don't talk nonsense. Now he finally looked like a soldier. When he spoke, he was calm and cold, and no one could refute him. His eyes were rude. Huaishi did not speak again. Is it feasible? Taurus asked again. We don't have the technical reserves in this area at present. Although it is a little difficult, it is not difficult. The pale fox sent the report to everyone, and everyone had a copy. Next, the undying bird will become a fire seed and start to burn. With a conservative estimate, if the minimum amount of heat is released steadily, with our current thermodynamic equipment, we can probably guarantee a stable burning for 4,000 years. Someone asked, what about after 4,000 years? After 4,000 years, there will be a change. The undying bird said, according to their own species and attributes, I will be the first, Bluebird will be the second, and the third. The specific list is here. If you have any opinions, you can raise them here. No one spoke. Big Brother took the lead to sacrifice, and the people behind him still dared to talk nonsense. It was embarrassing. There were many explorers who were afraid of death, not to mention that they would not really die. Then it settled. The undying bird made the decision. Next, Huaishi will assist the engineering team in the mining of minerals and be responsible for the construction of the huge framework of the metallurgical center. Fox will lead the team to solve the technical problems, and we will start in a month. After I leave, Fox will continue to be in charge of the city management. His original authority will not change, and my authority will be handed over to Huaishi. Do you have any objections? If not, then the meeting is adjourned. Wait a minute. Huaishi put its head close to the window of the conference room in shock. Why did you give it to me? Also, why am I last on the list? You're the last one because you're only 17 years old. If possible, I don't want you to die before them. If you don't want to accept it, I can tell you another reason. It's because you're the biggest, so you can burn the longest. The immortal bird answered unhurriedly, I gave you the position of leader because you can control the situation. To put it bluntly, no matter how bad the situation is, you can stuff the guys who don't want to enter the furnace. Are you satisfied? Huaishi was speechless. It was decided, regardless of whether Huaishi was willing or not. Although there were some problems in the process, the central furnace was finally completed 2 months later. After some calculations, the effect was a little worse than the original design, but it was still tolerable. Then, goodbye, everyone. Before entering the silent furnace, the immortal bird looked around at everyone for the last time. It's really pleasant to work with everyone. He paused for a moment and said sincerely, I hope you can continue to work hard and don't give up. He didn't wait for the others to answer. It slowly closed its 6 wings and plunged into the darkness of the furnace. As the heavy gates of the furnace slowly closed, his figure could no longer be seen. Only the warm wind slowly blew out of the furnace, and a dazzling sun hung above the sky inside the city again. It was as if the sun had returned to this abandoned land. There was no quick death, but a slow end in the long and painful burning of 4,000 years. If only sacrificing one person could make the whole world continue, it was really worth it. It's voluntary, you don't have to be sad. Fox said, Isn't this the responsibility of the Astronomy Association? Even if it's a drill, it's not an excuse to escape. Is there no other way? Huaishur asked. Of course there is. Fox calmly told him. It's just that those methods are not as effective as this one, and they don't have such a cost-effective ratio. Huaishur didn't speak again. He just remained silent, gnawing on the stone pillar beside his mouth, and the sound of crunching spread out. The light of the immortal bird shone on him, as if the coldness that had seeped into his bones had also been dispelled, warming Huaishur up. He quietly finished his lunch, then got up, carefully lifted the city inside the frame, and put it on his back. He said, Let's keep going. Where to? Fox asked. Anyway, it's the same everywhere. Why not go out for a walk? Huaishur asked. Maybe we can find a place where there's still heat. Fox shook his head. The probability is too small. We have nothing to do anyway, right? Huaishur smiled and tightened the belt that fixed the frame. He felt the bursts of warmth on his back. It doesn't matter if there's a tropical zone or not. At least we have to keep moving forward. Fox didn't object anymore. He just sighed. Then as you wish, Mr. Atlas. Atlas, the giant who propped up the world in the myths of the Roman region. It wasn't a bad name to call him that. Huaishur looked at the endless darkness in front of him, and stepped forward again. Big brother who looks like a dog, come on. In the silence, there was a distant call that sounded like an auditory hallucination again. Huaishur was stunned for a moment and couldn't help but laugh. Then come on. Be a qualified sled dog. Carrying the only remaining world, Huaishur's journey began again. He walked deeper into the darkness. Time began to accelerate again. Huaishur continued to walk forward. 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, as if in a trance, passed by with a nap. Along the way, he witnessed many solemn wonders. There were terrifying fortresses that were immersed in the deepest part of the darkness, exuding deadly malice. There were also dry stars that hung high in the sky and fell into dead silence. There were even more ruins and colossal statues. Those dead civilizations, in their final moments, all chose to carve rocks and leave behind their own images, hoping that they could be passed down to future generations. There were also some that were destroyed in the chaos of internal strife and war. Behind Huaishur, the Titan Empire continued to develop. After stabilizing its population of several million, its size had increased to 3 times its original size, and then it continued to shrink until it was only half of its original size. The speed of evolution became slower and slower, and the span of each evolution became larger and larger. In the end, compared to their original size, they had shrunk to 1/3 of their original size. Their eyes shone with the light of origin substance like flames. This is very normal. Fox, whose fur had already fallen off, lay on the bed and said, The trend of evolution is not that the stronger the better, but that the more suitable the better. Under the current circumstances, the smaller the size, the less the consumption, the more the growth. You look like you're going to die. I'm just going to die of old age. After all, I haven't undergone the deification transformation, and all of my evolution points have been invested into simulation. Fox was still calm. After I die, the management of the city will be handed over to the Taurus. The Taurus was the only one that wasn't on the list because it didn't have anything to burn. Right now, it was constantly burning itself, controlling the entire city's energy supply. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that it was the city's heart. You can decide the city's matters yourselves. Huaishur had walked enough. He stopped and lay down on the ground. I'm tired. I'm going to sleep for a while. What about after you wake up? I'll keep walking, Huaishur said. I have nothing to do anyway. Fox was amused by his stubborn appearance. You still haven't given up hope? I haven't thought about hope or anything. I just don't want to admit defeat, Huaishur said. At least I'm still alive. If he was still alive, then he had to keep moving forward. This wasn't a determination worthy of others' admiration. For Huaishur, it was a simple instinct. Then I wish you a pleasant journey. Fox said, Good night. Good night. Huaishur closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. In his dream, he dreamt of a lake. When he opened his eyes again, he was woken up by the Taurus. Where's Fox? He died 200 years ago. Taurus said. You've been sleeping for around 800 years. Time really isn't reliable. I feel like I've only slept for 2 or 3 minutes. It hasn't even been half an hour since we started moving. Huaishur smiled. What's the matter? The flames are about to extinguish. This time, it's the bluebird's turn. Taurus said. I wanted to wake you up to take a look. Huaishur nodded. After so many years, many giant beasts had already given up. They had sunk into their own slumber, waiting for their time to come. The bluebird seemed to be a little uneasy. After forcing a smile to everyone, it walked into the furnace. As the layers of gates opened, the flames illuminated Huaishur's eyes. He once again saw the undying bird. It was no longer the same as before. In the flames, a slightly old middle-aged man sat upright. When he felt the furnace door open, he raised his eyes and looked over. He was stunned for a moment, then immediately revealed a smile and looked at the blue bird. Is it your turn? The blue bird nodded. I'm a little scared. It's normal to be scared, but it's not as lonely as imagined. It's just a little painful. The undying bird stretched out its hand and warmly rubbed her head. It's good to get used to it. Just treat it as a nightmare. One day, someone will come in and wake you up. When that time comes, you have to smile like me, understand? His movements were gentle, but the blue bird couldn't help but shed tears and nodded vigorously. Okay. So, the undying bird smiled, as if it was free, turned into ashes and dissipated. The blue bird bathed in the flames, turned around, and waved goodbye to her companions outside the furnace. The furnace door closed. In silence, Huaishur retracted his gaze, climbed up from the ground, and once again stepped on the road ahead. The earth rumbled, playing the last stubborn melody in this dead world. He wanted to continue forward. They were still alive. They still existed. After the end of the second watch, begging for votes. Chapter 377. 1,400 years later, Qing Niao's burning ended early, and the furnace opened again. This time, 2 behemoths walked in. We're relatively small, so we've decided to go in together. This way we can last longer, and we'll have company. Holding hands, White Wolf and Moon Deer bid farewell to everyone and walked into the furnace. Then, they saw the engravings on the wall, and Qing Niao, who was looking at the records in deep thought. She seemed to have been awakened, and turned around blankly. Is it your turn? Yes. White Wolf grinned. You're leaving. It's a pity that my thesis will be finished soon. Green Bird sighed and turned around to smile at them. Don't give birth to a child. Not as boring as you. White Wolf and Qing Niao high-fived and took the flame, causing Qing Niao's silhouette to flicker. She sighed softly. It's not as scary as I expected, but I'm a little reluctant. She silently disappeared. The furnace closed. The White Wolf and Moon Deer lasted for 5,100 years, which was longer than expected. Next was Lord Scarlet Disaster. As a life form made of fungi, it was at a disadvantage, and only lasted for 600 years before it surrendered. Before it surrendered, it was rather unhappy and shouted that it could still burn for a while longer, but it was kicked away by the impatient lightless manticore. The manticore lasted for 3,100 years, and then, just like that, the behemoths walked step by step into the flames. Some were calm, some were helpless, some were angry, and some were unwilling. With the rapid flow of time, the eternal Titan Empire continued to be replaced. Wave after wave of leaders and citizens were born, grew up, and aged. They welcomed unification, then fell into division, and then quickly reunited again. Countless technologies met with failure or success. Systems were overthrown and then rebuilt. History was like a spiral, sometimes moving forward, sometimes moving backward. It should be said that there were new changes every day, but unfortunately, other than the burning sun, there was no change in the moon. Time passed. Huaishur continued to move forward. Until one day, Taurus constellation told him, "I'm leaving." So soon? Huaishur was in disbelief. "It's been more than 40,000 years, brother." Taurus constellation sighed helplessly. "I can't hold on any longer." "What about the energy supply after you leave?" "I've been replaced a long time ago. The new engine has been online for 300 years. My job now is to charge people every day." The Taurus sighed. "I really miss the time when they still thought I was the thunder god. Do you still want to move forward? Let's take a walk." "There's no harm in taking a walk," Huaishur said. "Look at how healthy I am." "You're the most abnormal one, aren't you?" The Taurus constellation snorted unhappily. "Your body has expanded by at least 10 times, why are you still growing?" "It means that stones are nutritious," Huaishur suggested. "You should eat more too." The Taurus did not reply. In front of him, the bolt of lightning slowly dissipated. Only a fleeting figure waved at him, and then quietly dissipated into the darkness. Huaishur was stunned for a long time. The last person who could talk to him had already left, which made him a little sad. But fortunately, he had recently made an electric violin and carried it on his shoulder. In the future, when he was bored, he could at least play a few. At least he felt that he had made great progress, and it was not a waste of time. He continued forward. In this way, he walked forward for another 5,000 years and slept for a long time. The messenger from the president spent 3 years in front of him, waking him up from his dream with a huge speaker, and nervously waiting for his answer. Huaishur was calmer than expected. "Is it my turn?" "That's good." Huaishur nodded, put down the city behind him, opened the cover, and reached out. "Bring me the furnace core." It took half a year to transfer the furnace core. Now, Huaishur's body had expanded too much. The furnace that was originally the size of his palm was now only the size of a glass bead. "Is it your turn?" The gray bear sitting in the open furnace core sighed. "Speaking of which, you've gotten bigger again. How are you going to get in?" "I don't need to go in," Huaishur said. "I have a more convenient way." Then he opened his mouth and threw the furnace core into his throat. With a howl, he swallowed it. He smacked his lips and seriously commented to the messenger waiting below. "You guys haven't done a very good job in removing the rust these past few years. There's a smell of rust." It wasn't the sweet and sour taste he had originally expected. It was really a bit disappointing. Then he was ignited. He felt the flames rise from his abdomen and envelop him in an instant. It was as if his body was going to disintegrate inch by inch, bringing with it an intense burning pain. In the pain, he couldn't help but bend down, suppressing the roar in his throat. Only the melted steel left from his body, turning into a metal lake with a radius of 1,000 miles. In the boiling metal lake, he took a deep breath, looked up to the sky, and spat out the fire that had been passed down for 50,000 years. In the fleeting light of the fire, the figures of giant beasts appeared. Gazing into Huaishur's eyes, they smiled and waved goodbye. "I'll leave it to you." "Yes, leave it to me." Huaishur nodded, but no one responded. Those figures dissipated. The intense pain of his bones growing burst out from his body. Countless organs roared as they welcomed the transformation in the fire. A pair of huge wings broke out from his back, revealing a ferocious and sharp appearance. Huaishur looked up to the sky and roared. His huge tail swept across, bursting out the last dragon's roar in this deathly silent world. Now he had already welcomed the final transformation in the flames. The terrifying body that was beyond the imagination of ordinary people skyrocketed again. In the cover of the flames, sharp dragon scales grew out from under the armor. The inherited flames spread to the original bare back, making the bare back more and more solemn in the flames, forming a solemn outline like the sun. And the eternal Titan Empire was suspended in the middle of the sun, like a bright pearl. The eternal empire and the eternal giant beast seemed to have merged into one. Huaishur had truly emerged from his original form and become the only master of this world, the one who carried the world. The final dragon Bahamut. Now, the world-devouring dragon spread his wings in this dead world and grinned. "Let's go." He soared into the sky, carrying the sun and the world on his back, and once again embarked on the endless journey. Just like that, 10,000 years, 20,000 years, in a trance, time accelerated crazily, as if it was fast-forwarded tens of thousands of times. There was no longer any sense of reality. In the long journey, the world behind him seemed to have evolved to the extent that he could not recognize it at all. With the departure of the scholars, this city had long been handed over to these evolved races. And now, they seemed to have become a blurry light and shadow. There was not even the slightest difference between each of them. "Thank you for your long blessings, divine Great Spirit." Thousands of figures emerged from the light and shadow, saying goodbye to him. "Today we welcome the final evolution, abandoning the mortal shell and merging into the ancient source." "Has it been decided?" Huaishur asked. 1. 2 million people, not a single one of them is hesitant or fearful. Such gratifying fruits are all thanks to your selfless dedication. The people in the light and shadow respectfully bowed. "We shall merge into the silver ocean and enter a unified realm, no longer being your burden. This is our final attack against the apocalypse, please bear witness to it all." "Then go." Huaishur nodded. "I have no objections. Then we shall meet again, Great Spirit." The people in the light and shadow seemed to smile. "I hope that after the end of the apocalypse we will be able to meet again in the new world." Goodbye then." Huaishur lowered his eyes and stared at the figures of light as they walked into the bright light one by one, merging into the brilliant silver ocean. In the boundless silver sea, a ray of light leaped and approached, as if it was reaching out to pinch his face. Finally, it returned to his back and merged into the corona of light. Pure and clear splendor sprinkled down, as if it had turned into the moon. "Let's go, my friend." A familiar voice sounded in his ears, then immediately dissipated. Huaishur chuckled softly, spread his wings, and flew into the dark distance. His journey was not over yet. He wanted to continue forward. The time that followed was meaningless. After an unknown number of years, Huaishur's body grew bigger and bigger. Unfortunately, there was no point of reference for him to compare himself to. He still continued forward, until one day, he felt a deep sense of sleepiness that was different from the past. Only then did he look around on the silent earth. "I'm going to sleep, what about you?" He turned around and asked the sun and moon behind him. The silver ocean was still surrounded by the sun, quietly scattering light. It only flickered for a moment as if it was saying goodbye. Then, "Good night." Huaishur smiled, lying on the ground, using his wings to gently protect the light, and fell into a deep sleep. He never opened his eyes again. In the dead silent world, only the flames were quietly dancing, stubbornly singing the epic of the past. 10,000 years, 20,000 years, the flames became like a candle in the wind, gradually dimming, but never extinguishing. Until one day a long-lost wind blew from afar, carrying with it thick water vapor. It turned into layers of pitch-black clouds, shrouding the barren world. Torrential rain fell for 3,000 years, filling the dry seabed and forming an ocean. Lush grass seeds grew from the dead earth, turning into a dense forest. Heaven and earth once again welcomed the rebirth, and that stubborn flame finally dissipated with the moon. In the extinguished flames, the first beast walked out, raised its eyes in a daze, and looked around. It saw the dawn of dawn. The vast and mighty night thus ended. Chapter 378. In the quiet study, as the book was closed, the capable old man with glasses looked up at the girl in front of him, and let out a long sigh. "Is this the ending?" the old man asked. "You could have let him live until the next era. But it's precisely because of this that the story is the most beautiful, isn't it?" The girl named Lily replied seriously. "After all, this isn't my stage. If I blindly act recklessly, I will only lose the original intention. The death of a hero before dawn is the best ending." The old man took off his glasses and stared at her carefully. He could not help but sigh. "If you were the author, you might become the kind of person who is especially cruel to the protagonist. The author is too exaggerated." Lily shook her head. "I don't have the ability to create things. I just picked out the elements I wanted and revised them into a collection. That's enough." The old man nodded and handed the book over carefully. "The DM and the others have good taste. To become a manager of Kingdom of Heaven, it's like being a librarian or a publishing editor. You don't need to create content. You just need to put the content in the most suitable place. And for you, who was born from legends, this is simply an instinct. I really envy them for being able to find a successor like you. Senior, you flatter me." Lily lowered her head, but she could not hide her excitement from being praised. "Help me thank the DM and the others for specially coming to send an old woman like me off." The old man smiled and took out a carefully preserved book from his backpack. "This is the certificate I obtained when I entered Utopia. Now that Utopia no longer exists, please return it to the ivory tower for me." It was an ancient book full of worldly wisdom, but the golden words on it had not faded. It had been flipped through countless times, and it still had the marks of the past without any damage. Gone with the wind. Lily was stunned for a moment when she felt the thick waves of origin substance in it. She could not help but look up. Without a doubt, this was one of the origin substance records in the heavenly kingdom. It contained an indispensable part of human mythology. "After borrowing books for so many years, I have to finish what I started." The old man winked at her happily. "However, it's fine to return it a few days later. I suggest you take a look if you have time." "Thank you." Lily nodded vigorously. "I'm not good at manipulating things. If there's anything I can thank you for, it's this." The old man smiled gently. "Then, goodbye, little girl. I hope you can grow up peacefully before the storm arrives." "Goodbye." Lily nodded and disappeared from the sofa. There was a knock on the door. "Please come in." The old man tilted his head, lit the cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and said rudely, "Let me see which idiot came from the Continuation Academy." Helplessly, Niflheim pushed the door open and smiled stiffly at the old man. There was nothing he could do about it. He was already dead, so what was wrong with scolding him? Moreover, the seniority was there. Let alone scolding you, would you still dare to say that your senior didn't beat you up well after beating you up? Take a seat. The old man pointed at the sofa in front of him, which had turned into an old chair without him noticing. "Don't spread this, and people will say that I'm taking advantage of my seniority and won't even let anyone from the continuation yard sit." Niflheim didn't say anything and sat down. The old man took a good look at the junior and shook his head regretfully. "You look all right. Why did you end up in the corner of the continuation yard? Forget it. Everyone has their own ambitions. Let's not force them. Let's talk business." She flicked the cigarette ash and asked, "Have you got the thing? I've given you so much time. Even if it's a knockoff, you should have copied it by now, right?" "We're almost there." Niflheim answered straightforwardly and took out a stack of manuscripts. Among your results, except for the rancher and the longevity beast. It's all here. Check it. Don't say that I'm still hiding it when I'm dead. The old man snapped his fingers, and a huge box appeared in front of Niflheim. This was the final research result of the Witch's Night. And the most important part of it, about the feasibility of biomaterialization. In addition to the research on the elements of destruction, this was the essence of her life's research. She didn't need to verify anything through the Witch's Night. She had already succeeded. Fu Yi was the proof of this result. She was the most suitable candidate for this Witch's Night. There was no need for sublimators to implement it, nor for scholars to explore it. Only ordinary people could show the value of this technology. A way for ordinary people to survive in the apocalyptic world. This was the research she was most proud of. On behalf of the former utopia, she left this last gift for the present realm. After Niflheim finished reading, he got up silently, bowed, and offered this gratitude on behalf of the present realm. The old man appreciated Niflheim's admiring look, smiled happily, and waved goodbye, indicating that he could go. Do you have any more instructions? Niflheim asked. It's up to you how to use this technology, whether to experiment or seal it, how to use my other information, whether to spread it or keep it, the old man said calmly. The dead should not interfere with the world of the present realm. What's more, shouldn't you be the one using it? Although the Continuation Academy is always unbelievably stingy, and the Directorate is always slow, I believe that the Continuation Academy can control its risks, and I believe that the Directorate can fulfill its mission. She paused for a moment and sighed helplessly. Although it's a pity, I have to admit that the mission of protecting the present realm can still be accomplished without the utopia, and it's done well. Then do your job well, kid. Don't let down an old woman's expectations. She grinned, but she didn't look old at all. Her eyes were as clear as a child's. I'll leave the present realm to you. Okay. Niflheim nodded with a serious expression. Leave it to us. He picked up the box carefully and turned to leave. Huaishur yawned, opened his eyes, smacked his lips, and saw the soft sunlight outside the window. It was no longer the darkness and silence that he was used to. He was stunned for a long time. Woof? Then, he realized that he was no longer a dog. He jumped up from the sofa in surprise and looked down at his hands. These familiar fingers. Then, he looked down at his legs. These familiar feet. Finally, he pulled open his belt a little, this familiar. He finally breathed a sigh of relief. He had finally changed back. He couldn't help but burst into tears. It was not until he was moved for a long time that he noticed the old lady sitting across the sofa, watching the show. The old lady held a teacup and took a sip, her eyes full of interest. Go on, old lady, I haven't seen a little fresh meat like you in a long time. Huaishur was stunned for a moment before he reacted. You are that person? That person? The old lady asked calmly. If you're talking about the unlucky old woman who died in the abyss, then it should be me. By the way, the cause of my death should be a stroke. I forgot to take my medicine when I got old. Huaishur smiled awkwardly. Then you called me here for something for you. Don't you want it? The old lady waved her hand. Forget it. With that, Huaishur's figure gradually disappeared. Wait a minute, I want it, I want it. Huaishur panicked and hurriedly shouted. Only then did the disappearance stop. The old lady smiled smugly as if she was bullying a child, making Huaishur completely powerless. According to the usual practice, as the explorer with the highest progress, I should indeed recognize you as the anointed one and give you something. The old lady pondered for a moment and said straightforwardly, but I don't have anything suitable for you here. After all, my specialty is abyssal biology. How about this? I'll give you this. She unbuckled the saddle bag at her waist, gently patted the dust on it, and handed it to Huaishur. Huaishur took it blankly, not knowing what it was. He opened it and looked inside. It was empty, as if there was nothing inside. However, after opening the innermost bag, he found something inside. He reached out and took it out, only to see Huaishi's expression twitched. In his hand there was a collar. Well, to be exact, it was a dog collar with a bell on it. There was also a leash attached to it. It looked solid and sturdy, very reliable. What is this? Huaishi looked at the old lady blankly. Well, this was a gift from a large group leader. I later asked the people in the Helios workshop to modify it. According to the present realm standards, it can be considered a divine artifact. The old lady's words stunned Huaishi. What the hell? Divine artifact? That's it? Where was God? Could it be a collar used by a divine dog? Huaishi flipped the necklace over and over again, hoping to see the word Shao Tian in between the cracks, or any other name would do too. Until the old lady sighed helplessly. It's not the collar, it's the bag. Oh. Huaishi finally reacted. Its full name is the Wise Man's Survival Bag. It has accompanied me in hell for many days. To be honest, I'm a little reluctant to give it away. The old lady said, its effect is what you just saw. Every week, you can take out a small civilian item that can help your current situation. If you fall into the desert, you can take out a bottle of water. If you're too cold, you can take out a coat. But at best, that's the effect. You'd better not expect too much. Huaishi was at a loss. It sounded incredible that he could take out something to improve his situation every week. Even if it was a small civilian item, it was enough to be of great help. But why did he take out a collar? Was he hinting at him to wear it? Please give me a monthly ticket. I feel super awesome, I'm speaking so loudly. Chapter 379. I don't know about that. The old woman shrugged helplessly. I don't really understand the specific mechanism, but the thing you took out will definitely help you. If you don't understand, just keep it. I believe it will be useful soon. Okay. Huaishi put away the items and said nervously, actually, that's not the main reason I came here. Yesterday's illusion, right? The old woman nodded. She had obviously seen through the mountain ghost's sacred mark on Huaishi. Huaishi breathed a sigh of relief and looked forward to it. It's so troublesome. When the Utopia was still around, I should have been able to cross the Rainbow Bridge and get it done. The old woman scratched her head and pondered for a long time. Suddenly, she snapped her fingers. The scenery outside the window suddenly changed, as if they had arrived in front of a snowy mountain. Okay, you can go out, she said. You should be able to see it when you go out. Huaishi got up in confusion, pushed the door open, and saw the familiar snowy mountain outside. He seemed to have seen it somewhere before. But he soon realized that this was the snowy mountain he came to when he first entered the Night of the Witch. When he looked back, he found that the hut behind him had disappeared. So he walked forward on the narrow path, passing the cave where he once woke up and the place where he fought with the hyenas in the past. Finally, he stopped at the edge of the river. When he looked down at the waves in the water, he saw his reflection. It was no longer the appearance of the husky, but had become his own appearance. It was just that his appearance was so unfamiliar that it was difficult for him to distinguish. In the reflection, the young man's face did not change much, but the meaning between his eyebrows was different from before. It was as if he had been reborn. As if there was a faint flame, his black pupils were quiet and deep, and the immaturity revealed by his age was swept away. Even if it was the same face and the same expression, no one could treat him as a child. Unknowingly, he seemed to have changed, but it also seemed that he had not. He just became different from the past. Perhaps it was just growth. Just a little bit more mature. When a ripple slowly drifted past, Huaishi's reflection slowly changed, revealing his former silhouette, causing him to freeze in place. This was yesterday's illusion. It was already completely different from today. What surprised him even more was that there seemed to be the sound of a bubble bursting in his consciousness. Then, in a trance, the broken pieces of memories in his memory resurfaced from the darkness, mending and filling up every inch of the gaps. Those childhood memories that had long been lost were actually recovered. Not only that, they even continued to be unearthed and extended. In the end, everything from birth to now was still vivid in his mind. The child who once carried a cello and walked alone on the streets seemed to have become a completely different person. But something was still the same. It ran through his short 17 years, and it would continue to come back: the past, the present, and the future. He was still alive. After a long, long time, Huaisher couldn't help but let out a long sigh. He didn't spit out plasma sparks or destroy everything, but he felt that the anxiety and depression in his chest were drawn out of his lungs along with his exhalation. A comfortable coolness spread in his lungs along with his breath, and he couldn't help but stretch his body. He heard a crackling sound in his body. It seemed that he had finally stepped into maturity from a long seedling period. The mountain ghost's sacred mark was growing rapidly. In the end, layers of dark green colors overlapped in the crack on his chest, as if it was about to bloom. Isn't this a little more like it? Huaisher lowered his head and stared at his former self in the reflection. He couldn't help but grin and give his former self a thumbs up. Keep up the good work, Huaisher. So, the young man in the reflection smiled and gave his future self a thumbs up. In the hidden hut, the girl who had been leaning against the window from beginning to end looked at a certain someone who was laughing foolishly at his reflection. She couldn't help but shake her head and sigh. In the end, there's no sense of existence. Fu Yi shrugged helplessly. It feels quite fitting for my character. There are always side effects of evolution. It should be fine after leaving this place. Compared to that, the old man beside her was rather surprised by another thing. There's no ascension? Could I have been wrong? She pondered. Presiding over the operation of the Silver Sea, even if it's just an experience, should be enough to complete the ascension. That feeling like I'm floating? Fu Yi was stunned. I thought I had caught a cold, but it's not? I feel like I've missed out on a lot of money. If your own consciousness doesn't reject the change, the ascension won't stop. The old man saw through Fu Yi's disguise at a glance. He was not unhappy about it, but just curious. I have to say, it's rare for you to insist on being a normal person to this extent. Are you the kind who hates ascenders? No, I'm quite envious. Fu Yi thought for a moment before saying seriously, but it's that kind of superficial envy. You can understand, right? Compared to ascenders, I think it's more convenient to be a normal person. Envy, longing, desire. It was true that he had such emotions before, but at most, it was the kind of emotion that he felt through the television. It was like admiring handsome explorers, respecting people who had become heroes, and envying those handsome characters who could still light a cigarette in the midst of a storm of bullets. She knew that she would never be such a person. She did not have that kind of talent, and she did not have a dream that must be realized. Although there were some small impulses occasionally, in the end it was just that. What's wrong with the children nowadays? One or two of them are either frighteningly stubborn or insufferably rational. The old man raised his eyebrows. I thought. She was silent for a moment before saying seriously, You will need some changes. I actually think so too. The girl sighed softly. But not long ago, I realized that in fact, the thing I don't desire the most is change. She did not need to change. Even if her father and mother's relationship was broken, and they divorced, even if her mother planned to remarry and have a child, even if her efforts were not rewarded, and reality was getting farther and farther away from the scene she had hoped for. Things in the world were not as one wished. But she could understand all of this. The reality that belonged to her was already perfect enough. Everything was predestined. In fact, everything had already been set in order a long time ago. There was no need for her to add any more unnecessary details. No matter how difficult it was to accept, it was not an excuse to resist and deceive herself. She just needed some time, a little space of her own, a place where she could temporarily escape everything. And a friend who could help her leave all of this. Just like running away from home, there would be a day when she would have to look back at the way home. She was well aware of this, and she did not intend to delay this day for too long. Just for a while. As long as she had a short night of freedom, she could go back and face everything she needed to face. Like a child who had left home, willfully playing, running on the streets, trying everything her parents did not allow. This was her night of freedom. Now, the night of the witch was over. She should go home, even if the outside world was magnificent and huge. I understand. The old man chuckled softly and touched her hair lovingly. You are stronger than I thought. But are you sure you don't need my help? As she spoke, she looked out of the window at the young man who was smiling foolishly by the river. She shook her head and sighed. You don't know if he has a strange brain circuit or is a natural scumbag. Even if the world ends, he won't understand, right? No need. Fu-Yi looked away from the back of the figure. I changed my mind. He is really a good friend, better than I expected. She was silent for a moment and suddenly said, Unfortunately, I am not. It was too easy to deceive such a person. Fu-Yi had a deep understanding of this. As long as you smiled at him, he would smile back. As long as you were his friend, he would not guard against you. As long as you asked, he would give. He would do his best. He would never disappoint. Because of this, she did not want to say her most embarrassing request. Would he agree? No, it should be asked, would he refuse? And then, would he be loyal to this relationship? No, would he betray her? And then what? Would she be happy? The most important thing was, would he feel happy? This was not right? Wasn't love mutual? If it was one-sided demand and one-sided dependence, wouldn't it be like a beggar? Thinking about it carefully, from the past until now, she seemed to be constantly trying to rely on others. Relying on her father's doting, relying on her mother's support, relying on her appearance to get love, relying on her authority to ignore the rules, and then relying on her glib words to get friends when she was at her loneliest. Maybe she was good at this, maybe even if she relied on others, no one would say anything. But she did not know why, she did not want to rely on those things anymore. Just looking at the back of the figure outside the window, as long as she compared them, she would know that such a parasitic life was not happy at all. It was just begging in the silence. The old man seemed to notice the girl's disappointment. He raised the box in his hand and handed it to her. Smoke. Fu-Yi stretched out her hand, but the box was taken back. No. The old man grinned, like a child who succeeded in a prank. He patted her head. You are still a child. Have some tea. The fragrant and warm teacup came to Fu-Yi's hand. Evelyn. The old man suddenly said. Yes. My name is Evelyn, Evelyn of the Chachel family. The old man smiled and told her, the registered name is Cycle. Although I am a little late to introduce myself, I hope to be your friend. Fu-Yi was stunned for a long time. After a long time, she lowered her head. Her eyes were filled with tears and seemed to be a little red. My name is Fu-Yi. It means rely on, Fu-Yi, I know. The old man stretched out his hand forcefully and held her hand. He shook it and nodded happily. Then we are friends. Please rest assured and rely on me, even if the time we spent together is so short. She paused for a moment, and her expression became solemn. She was serious and dignified. She asked in a deep voice, then, in the end, I have a question to ask you. In the short, uneasy silence, the corners of her mouth suddenly curled up, revealing a gentle smile. Did you have fun? Fu-Yi was stunned. After a long time, she nodded vigorously. Yes. Then, the smile became gratified, full of joy and satisfaction. The old man reached out and gently hugged the girl in front of him. Then smile, my friend. She kissed the girl's forehead and said goodbye softly. I hope that we can meet again at the source after a long time. You are about to embark on your own journey, and I will return to my home. But before that, she squeezed her eyes like a child preparing for a prank and told her with a smile, I have prepared a surprise for you. Chapter 380. When the bell of morning rang, the temporary bubble that only existed for a night outside the present realm was shattered. Countless illusions dissipated. In the empty world, the old creator slowly looked back and looked at everything that she had created in her life. Now everything would pass away with her. This was the last moment of her death. When she turned around, she saw a slender figure who had appeared out of nowhere. The black dress flowed on the ground like water, and the red gold embroidery outlined a complicated coat of arms that conveyed profound mysteries. After so many years, she did not seem to have changed at all. Her smile was still the same. When one looked carefully, it was difficult to see her face. One's eyes would only be lost in the thin halo, leaving no impression or memory. However, one could feel the majesty that made one's soul tremble. Yo, long time no see. The woman who suddenly appeared smiled and raised her hand. Yes. Evelyn nodded and sighed softly. Long time no see. Unfortunately, there is not much time left for me. What a pity. She patted the place beside her. Do you mind sitting with me for a while? Of course. The woman came forward and sat beside her. She looked at the wrinkles on her face, and her eyes became sympathetic. It has been hard on you for so many years. The old man shook his head indifferently. For the Republic, isn't this something that should be done? The Republic has been shattered, just like the Republic. I have reminded you on the day it was established. But the mission still continues, doesn't it? The old man chuckled. He opened his backpack and pulled out the box that he had been carrying for many years. Then, he handed it over. This is for you. I had thought that I would never have the chance to give it to you. However, it is great to be able to meet you. The box was opened. It was bright gold. It was a holy tree that seemed to grow out of gold, and the slender box was just one of its branches. After so many years, it still carried a stubborn vitality that was difficult to extinguish, and its fragrance was still there. The woman was stunned for a moment and looked up in disbelief. You found it especially for me? The old man shook his head. It is just in passing. Don't feel bad. Thank you. The box was carefully closed. She sighed softly. At least there's one more possibility. It's not easy to hear your gratitude. The old man laughed heartily and patted his knee. Although it's hard work, it's not a loss to be thanked by you once. How about you sacrifice yourself for the gods? Her slender arms intimately wrapped around the old man's shoulders as she asked, Is there anything else I can do for you? Don't worry and make your wish boldly. I'm not the stingy type. That's all. The old man shook his head and thought for a moment. It's not easy to see you. Why don't you accompany me for a while? Isn't that natural? She held the old woman's gradually tired body and gently accompanied Evelyn by her side. The two of them quietly stared at the shattered dream. They watched as the sky gradually dissipated, the earth collapsed, and everything disappeared into the darkness. From the crack in the bubble, the magnificent light of the emergence realm was revealed. The beautiful rainbow-like light reflected in the old woman's eyes, making her eyes seem as if they had been lit up, resplendent and flawless. There was no loss and there was no regret. She just quietly stared at the world that she had spent her life guarding, as if she had seen this magnificent creation for the first time. The pure eyes of a child were shining. Look, she murmured in a trance, this world is so beautiful. Yes. The gentle voice that accompanied her softly recited, Look at the swaying world carrying the sky. Look at the earth and the ocean and the distant sky. Look at how everything sings for the future. This is the world that you have created, the era that truly belongs to you. This is the honor and reputation that you deserve in your life. The solemn and gentle voice told her, I will witness you, just as you once witnessed me. So, the old woman smiled. She was satisfied. As the mournful bell in the distance gradually dissipated, a crack quietly appeared on the old woman's face. Is it my time? Yes. A pair of arms gently hugged her, stroked her white hair, and gently said goodbye, goodbye, my little Cheshire cat. Shouldn't it be goodbye forever? The old woman smiled and sighed softly. Goodbye forever, my friend, goodbye forever. In the silence after the bell, she fell into a deep sleep. Along with the bubbles, she sank into an eternal sweet dream. She didn't wake up. Huaishe finally opened his eyes. He felt thirsty and weak, as well as waves of dizziness. It was as if he had a hangover, and he couldn't help but collapse. His origin substance had dried up. The witch's night had consumed too much of his origin substance. Even though he had an abundance of origin substance, he couldn't help but have a splitting headache. He didn't know where he was. Then, he saw the saddlebag that had appeared at his waist at some point, as well as the familiar 10 fingers and the familiar ceiling. He had returned home. It was as if a lifetime had passed. Although time was speeding up, the long, long experience still made him feel an indescribable exhaustion and sleepiness, as well as a deep sense of doubt. Was he in a dream or in reality? Was he the child of the past, the giant beast just now, or the young man now? It was hard to tell. While he was deep in thought, a white hand suddenly reached out from the side, holding a cup. It broke his daze and pulled him back to reality. Coffee, freshly brewed. Want some? He looked up and saw a delicate, impeccable face, as well as a slight smile on her lips. Huaishe couldn't help but sigh. It's rare to see you like this. I went to see an old friend, so I had to put on some makeup. Crow shrugged. Judging from your appearance, you must have gained quite a bit, right? Do you want some coffee? The kind with a sleeping agent added. Huaishe climbed out of bed. He didn't take the cup, but he couldn't help but open his arms and hug her tightly. Crow froze, as if she had been frightened. I haven't seen you in so long that I'm not used to it. Huaishe awkwardly let go of her. He realized that he had been rude, and then said earnestly, Thank you. Crow looked away and took a sip from the cup. I don't remember doing anything good. Ah, crap. She suddenly realized that she had forgotten to add sleeping pills to the coffee. Huaishe left her there, and rushed out of the basement. He ran into the living room and shouted into the kitchen, Fang Shu, I'm back. Ah, young master, welcome back. The old man in an apron poked his head out. Breakfast is almost ready. Do you want the eggs fully cooked or, without waiting for him to finish, Huaishe rushed forward and gave him a big hug. The old man was stunned for a long time, and then he felt a little embarrassed. Did something happen? No, nothing. I'm just very grateful to you. Huaishe took 2 steps back and waved his hand. I'm going out first. It's urgent. I'll come back for lunch at noon. Ah, young master, wait a minute. At least first, before Fang Shu could finish, Huaishe had already pulled his coat and pushed the door open. He ran wildly, dragging the bicycle that he had just repaired and pedaling with all his might. He headed to the city. He didn't know how Fu Yi was and if she was in any danger. He had to confirm it. Otherwise, he would feel uneasy. The bicycle that had just been repaired creaked under the rough pedaling. Huaishe sped all the way and rushed into the city. He didn't even have time to stop the bike before he left it beside the stairs and rushed into the hotel. Ward round. Without explaining, Huaishe directly slapped his ID on the desk at the front desk. Hurry up. Fu Yi should be staying here, right? This time, unexpectedly, the front desk didn't doubt his age. Perhaps he was directly convinced by the persuasive power of the soul link. He quickly pulled up the records and was stunned. What's wrong? Huaishe frowned. She's not here. He had clearly sent her to the hotel yesterday. No, Ms. Fu Yi did stay here last night. The front desk raised his head in confusion. 5 minutes ago, she checked out. She should have just left. They brushed past each other. Huai Shi was stunned for a long time. However, according to the front desk, Fu Yi didn't seem to be abnormal. Instead, she seemed to be alive and kicking. She shouldn't have suffered any harm. But to run away without even saying goodbye, she didn't have him as a good brother in her heart at all. This suddenly made Huai Shi a little disappointed. After walking out of the hotel, he felt a wave of fatigue. He sat on the stairs and stared blankly at the traffic in the distance. The doorman didn't know what he wanted to do, but because of his ID, he didn't dare to drive him away. He could only stand in the distance and watch with some worry. In the silence, light footsteps came from behind him. A rather sturdy-looking dog walked over, passed by him, stopped, and then skillfully raised one of its hind legs and sprinkled a string of liquid with a strong smell. Finally, its tail wagged proudly and swung past the tip of Huai Shi's nose. Even a dog dares to bully me. Huai Shi woke up from his daze and couldn't help but be angry. But when he took a closer look, he couldn't help but be stunned. The classic black and white color scheme, the icy blue eyes, the unruly gaze and the devilish smile when he grinned, as well as the overly large physique, why did it look so familiar? And why was this stupid dog looking at him with such disdain? Ah, Huai Shi, don't run around. In the direction of the parking garage, a panicked voice sounded. Come back quickly. Ah, why did you pee? I'm sorry, I haven't bought a rope yet, Sai. Huai Shi, why are you here? Huai Shi turned back helplessly and looked at the embarrassed Fu Yi. He then looked at the husky that was playing happily at Fu Yi's feet, pointed at it, and then pointed at himself. What's your name? It's a long story. Fu Yi awkwardly reached out and violently pulled the tail that was sweeping Huai Shi's face, and pulled the husky back. After the prank, the husky even grinned proudly at Huai Shi, revealing a mouth full of small, sharp teeth with a metallic color. The behemoth in dog skin sneezed and squatted down obediently next to Fu Yi. Its noble head was raised, and its icy blue eyes were bright and full of expression, looking very majestic. In the indescribable awkwardness, Fu Yi reached out and pointed at a rope that was exposed in Huai Shi's saddlebag. Can you lend me the rope? It even chewed up someone's bumper just now. Huai Shi lowered his head, opened the saddlebag, and looked at the collar inside, and the dog in front of him. He was stunned for a long time. His expression gradually became very interesting. In the end, the teenager's shoulders shook, but he couldn't help but laugh loudly. It was as if he finally felt this little joke from fate. He was overjoyed. Hint instruction number 3, please be friends with Fu Yi forever. Chapter 381. In the silent hall, the attendees sat silently in their seats, raising their heads and gazing ahead. The people who had come from all over the world were different. Some were old, some were young, some were fat, some were thin, some were ugly, some were beautiful. Elites in suits, farmers with sunburn marks on their faces, and workers with calluses on their fingers were sitting on the same bench. It was a strange sight. This place should be a temple, but there was no statue in the temple. The huge stone foundation only carried the projection of the realm of discovery that was constantly operating. Under the projection, the calm voice continued. How can we ensure the continuation of everything to the greatest extent? The middle-aged man named Jaeger stood under the projection and solemnly read the report from the Continuation Institute. The symbiosis of groups? The sole existence of individuals? Genetic inheritance? Or is it the continuation of civilization? I believe that this is the final question that the fallen Creator left for all his colleagues, a question that is worth us spending a lifetime to explore. This is not just an apocalyptic response exercise. Among them, the crucial biomaterialization, also known as ether sublimation, will be uploaded in the preload area of the 3 secret instruments in the next 3 cycles. According to our calculations, this technology has successfully set back the Doomsday clock by 4 minutes. This is a great and merciful creation for all the ordinary people in the present realm. To this day, the legacy of the Utopia is still constantly guarding the entire world. But what she did was far more than that. Jaeger said solemnly. What she gave us was even more than we imagined, including a brand new breakthrough in the study of the elements of destruction. In Ms. Chachel's final experiment, we successfully observed a new discovery. By simulating the food chain of ranchers, our results are infinitely close to the category of the beast of eternal life. Not only did we establish the opposite and corresponding conclusion between the two, but we also got more than we expected. Even if those present did not understand the complicated theories and terms circulating among scholars, they still understood the meaning of this result from their assistants. This dangerous result was not so much a surprise as it was more appropriate to call it a shock. The reason was that the idea was too crazy, like a heavenly steed soaring across the sky. It was comparable to a high-speed train driving on the highway, rampaging, ignoring the rules and taboos as if they were nothing. He completely regarded the extremely dangerous elemental of destruction as a lab rat in a cage. After a long period of research and countless failures, he finally succeeded in connecting the two on the same main axis under a specific perspective. A perfect balance and commonality had been found between the two. Using this as a foundation, he built a set of completely feasible theoretical tools. No, it should be called a bridge. Whether it was analyzing the beast of eternal life by studying the rancher, or researching the existence of the rancher by studying the beast of eternal life, the massive amount of research on the two would be transformed through this bridge. Even if there were limitations, it was still equivalent to opening up a brand new path. A new field of abyssal biology would be created in Evelyn's hands. From now on, there would be countless scholars carrying on the torch and following the path she blazed. She unreservedly gave him a fish. This lady still made a great contribution to the present realm in the last minute before she passed away. Jaeger propped up his crutches, tried to prop up his calves, straightened his body, and said solemnly, "Here, I propose that everyone stand up and observe a moment of silence for the passing of this wise woman." Without hesitation, no matter where they came from, no matter where they were going, whether it was the Directorate of Defense, the Preservation Court, the Technical Department, the Archaeological Team, or even the Stone Cauldron Society, the Bronze Eye, and so on outside the Astronomical Society, no matter where the representatives came from, at this moment, under Jaeger's initiative, all the participants stood up in unison and bowed their eyes solemnly to the old woman who appeared from the projection, paying the highest respect. A full 3 minutes. Even if it was only 3 minutes, the whole world stopped moving for her passing. This was the funeral of the Creator. Chapter 382. Name: Huaisher. Age: 17 years old. Professional student, right? Yes, part-time supervisor of XIN High Astronomy Association, disaster musician, abyss chef, and a bunch of other stuff. In the security room, Huaisher sat behind the chair and introduced himself sincerely. He then placed his ID on the table. The security guard had an expression that said, "Are you King kidding me?" He had probably never seen such a serious Chunibu before. After a long silence, he could not figure out what this guy wanted to do. Could he be the child of the factory's leader? No, wait, there was no one with the surname Huai in the factory. What's the reason for your visit? The security guard tapped the pen on the table. Who are you looking for? Do you have a way to contact them? Do you want me to call them out for you? It would be great if you could call them out for me. The young man sitting across the table also laughed. I'm here to look for the boss of this biopharmaceutical company, Ding Nank, and his 6 accomplices. They violated the Border Material Control Regulations and were arrested by the supervisor of XIN High Astronomy Association, which is me, although this thing is usually referred to as a black letter. As he spoke, the young man pulled out a heavy longsword from his saddlebag. He was stunned for a moment before he awkwardly put it back. Sorry, I took the wrong one. It's this time. A letter with a black cover was placed on the table and slowly pushed over. It stopped before the security guard. The security guard frowned. What the hell? He picked up the letter in confusion and looked around. After confirming that this was a prank, his expression became more and more unhappy. Then, he saw the little red dots that fell on his body from outside the window. They were like little stars in the sky, twinkling and twinkling. Locked on by the infrared sight, he raised his head blankly and finally saw the suppression team poking their heads out from the high wall outside the window and the shiny black barrels in their hands. The good brothers' long guns had a persuasive power that words could not compare to. In an instant, the security guard understood Huaishi's intention. He obediently knelt on the ground and covered his head with his hands. I don't know anything. I'm just a worker. The good brothers who rushed in didn't care about this. Regardless of whether it was a human or a ghost, they would first pin it on the neck and slowly settle the score later. Following Huaishi's signal, they instantly jumped over the wall and launched an attack inside. His movements were extremely fast, like a hot knife through butter. Huaishi cheered him on from behind. Charge! Charge! Good luck, comrades! Although the Russian Federation is big, we have nowhere to go. Behind us is M.O. Before he could finish his sentence, old Fu almost kicked him from behind. Shut up! Don't interfere with the command. He pointed to the side with a look of disdain. Old Wang, take out your phone and let the kid play with it for a while. Don't let him cause trouble. I'm a dignified inspector. I'm just trying to boost morale. How am I interfering with the command? You call that depressing? How is that boosting morale? Alright, then how about I perform a Bach unaccompanied cello suite for everyone? Look, Old Wang just looked over. He wants to hear it. Old Wang, who was next to them, looked up at the sky. He didn't want to continue the conversation at all. If he wasn't well informed, he wouldn't have known. There were rumors in the bureau that Huaishi had been taken home by the director's daughter and slept in the same room every day. It was said that the director didn't even dare to interfere. He heard from Secretary Shaoli that when he came to deliver the documents, he even heard him arguing with the family dog at home. Maybe he was under too much pressure these 2 days and was angry. He was thinking about when to tactfully persuade the director to see a psychiatrist. He was distracted and didn't pay attention to the quarreling two people at all, until the sound of gunfire came from the depths of the pharmaceutical factory. The roar was endless. Soon, his expression changed. These bastards had grenades. At this moment, he looked at Director Fu and asked for instructions. Director Fu also knew that this was not the time to quarrel. He suppressed his anger and glared at Huaishi. What he meant was, "What are you waiting for? Go." Huaishi took out his phone and sat at the side. He looked as if he didn't understand why his uncle was glaring at him. Old Fu's face turned red and green. He gritted his teeth and stomped his feet. He pulled out his pistol and prepared to charge. But he was immediately stopped by Huaishi. What a joke. If anything happened to him, how would he face his good brother in the future? Okay, I'll do it, okay? He pressed old Fu down on the chair. Brother Xiang Wang, you're precious. Don't take risks so easily. Old Fu's face turned green when he saw that Huaishi had changed his address from Old Fu to Brother Xiang Wang. However, he couldn't get angry. He could only suppress the pain in his liver. Huaishi sighed in his heart. I'll bring him a few bottles of liver protection pills during the new year. It's not easy for this brother of mine. After taking advantage of him, Huaishi finally patted her butt and walked to the front. All the resisting enemies had hidden in a 4-story office building. Now they had sealed the windows and were holding all kinds of prohibited weapons to confront the suppression forces outside. They shouted that they wanted to negotiate. It was a pity that this place was too close to the city. It was not convenient for tanks and mortars to be used. Otherwise, according to Director Fu's temper, he wouldn't care about the damn judges. Drag them all to the main cannon of the tank to talk. Huaishir walked to the bunker in front of him and took the loudspeaker from the captain. He stuck his head out and shouted, "Listen up, the people inside. You've been surrounded by me." The curtains on the second floor suddenly shook. Huaishir suddenly shrank his head and felt a shrill whistle fly over his head. He was stunned for a moment and then became furious. "Damn it, I'm the Xinhai Inspector, Jinling Decapitation King, Disaster Musician, and the Abyss Cooking Demon. I'm the rising star of the administration. I'm a 4th-class military officer of the Astronomy Association. I'm here to negotiate with you. Not only do you not surrender, you even dare to fight back? You're revolting. Fine, since you don't want to eat prison food, then I'll treat the whole village to a meal." He rummaged through his saddlebag for a long time and found a bottle that looked like a wine jug from a pile of junk. He weighed it in his hand and threw it into the door that had been blown open by the suppression forces. The bottle drew an arc in the air and quickly fell behind the door. The lackey sent by the smugglers behind the door saw a black thing thrown in and almost jumped up in shock. Then, he saw the thing hit the wall and exploded. A handful of scarlet things splashed out and flowed all over the ground. 2 more drops fell on his hand. He lowered his head to look at them and carefully sniffed them. He was in disbelief. "Is this blood?" Then, he saw a faint layer of dark green sprouting quickly in the 2 drops of blood. It looked like mold. He felt that he couldn't breathe. It was difficult to breathe, and his body quickly became numb. Not only him, but everyone in the hall at the moment felt their bodies become stiff. Countless strains of mold sprouted in their mouths, noses, and the corners of their eyes, spreading all the way to their lungs. Half a minute later, everyone who could move could not help but bend over and vomit violently. But all they vomited was their own blood. The fierce poison from the abyss directly caused a massive hemorrhage in their stomach. Not long after the blood flowed out, it turned into blood clots covered in dark green mold. Not long after, the 10 or so people who had been stubbornly resisting were all paralyzed on the ground. They were out of breath. Seeing that after Huaishir threw in a bag of things, the inside quieted down as if it had been sprayed with insecticide. All the good brothers of the suppression forces were stunned. Only Huaishir lit a cigarette with a lonely expression and sighed to the sky. "It's poison," he said. "I poisoned the blood." Simply put, he used his own beginner-level alchemy to release his own blood. After pouring in a pile of origin substance, calamity ash, and 2 drops of azure crown dragon blood, he didn't care what kind of person he was. He made a pot of stew and used the crudest method to stimulate the poison in it. Then, he put it in a bottle. The shelf life was about 12 hours. He just needed to drink it as soon as he opened the bottle. When necessary, he could use it as a blood bag and transfuse it back to himself. After all, it was his blood and his poison. He couldn't poison himself. Excluding the speechless look in Crow's eyes, he felt that he was a genius. After lingering for a long time and not leaving, he finally took 2 submachine guns and 5 or 6 magazines from the Special Affairs Department. He finally came out from behind cover and carried the 2 submachine guns to the hall behind the door. "Hello? Where are you, fellow countrymen?" he yelled at the top of his lungs. "Astronomy will give you warmth." Unfortunately, no one responded to him. There was only the sound of labored breathing. Huaishir couldn't help but sigh. These days, no one wanted the warmth that was delivered to their doorstep. When he thought about how the Special Affairs Department had invited them to tea for free, Huaishur was moved by their noble character and unquestionable integrity. After being moved for 5 or 6 seconds, he heard the faint sound of a whistle coming from upstairs. Suddenly, hoarse moans could be heard from behind him. Huaishur didn't even turn his head. He aimed behind him and pulled the trigger. After a series of gunshots, a guy covered in green fur fell to the ground. Immediately afterwards, even more moans could be heard from the ground. The lackeys, who had been on the verge of death, began to squirm and crawl up from the ground. It was as if they had turned into zombies. Their faces were pale, and their eyes glowed with a dark green light. This was the sign of origin substance burning itself. Huaishur knew with a single glance that this group of people was completely dead. Originally, even if they had been poisoned by Huaishur, they would only have to stay in the ICU for a few days. But now, it seemed that this group of people had been injected with the zombie serum. Once they were stimulated by something, they would quickly transform into something that was neither human nor ghost. They would madly attack all living things in front of them. Even when they died, they wouldn't know that they had become someone else's cannon fodder. That's why they dared to get involved in border smuggling when they couldn't do anything else. Are they afraid that they won't die quickly enough? Huaishur shook his head. He raised his gun and prepared to give them a quick death. Immediately afterwards, he felt the ground beneath his feet shake, and a cracking sound came from above him. As countless cracks grew, the heavy concrete floor came crashing down on Huaishur. In the blink of an eye, a fleeting shadow jumped out from the countless concrete fragments. Before he could react, it suddenly appeared behind Huaishur. The sickle in its hand chopped down at his neck. Then, he saw Huaishur raise his hand and let go of the weapon in his hand. From under Huaishur's feet, a pitch-black shadow quickly rose up and caught the 2 submachine guns falling from the air. It faced him and revealed the narrow darkness in the barrels. Then, the red glove pulled the trigger. Dazzling flames spewed out from the darkness. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.